The night everything went quiet in a small town in Maine. By the time the deputy reached the corner by the bait shop, the dog was still standing in the middle of the road with its mouth open and nothing coming out. Its chest moved, its throat worked. But the street remained perfectly still. No bark, no chain rattle, no gulls, no engine from the truck idling outside the grocery. The rotating light above the harbor office turned without a hum, as if the whole town had been lowered under deep water and left there. A woman on the sidewalk was crying with both hands over her face, and he could see it in the movement of her shoulders, but the sound of it was gone. Later, people argued over when the silence had begun. Some said it came all at once, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, while someone was weighing cod on the dock and someone else was ringing up canned soup at the market. Others insisted it crept in over a few seconds, thinning the world piece by piece until every familiar noise had fallen away. The old men who spent their mornings in the diner said the radio had been speaking one moment and moving its little needle in mute disbelief the next. A teacher claimed she had watched a room full of children laugh at something, all of them bent over their desks with delight, and had felt a sickness rise in her when not a single sound reached her. What remained constant in every account was the scale of it. It was not deafness, it was not weather, it was as if the town itself had stopped producing noise. The place was the kind of coastal town that did not change much from one year to the next. Lobster boats knocked against the pilings before dawn, freezers hummed in back rooms, screen doors slapped shut. The church bell carried over water on clear evenings. On damp days, the foghorn from farther out sounded at patient intervals, and nobody paid attention to it because it had always been there. According to local reports from that year, nothing unusual had happened before the silence came down. No storm warning, no power surge, no accident large enough to explain the panic that followed. The electricity stayed on, the lights burned, the clocks kept moving, only sound had gone missing, and for several hours the town moved through its own life like actors trapped behind glass. At first, people did what frightened people always do. They checked the obvious things. They clapped beside their own ears, they slammed cabinet doors, they shouted into each other's faces until their necks tightened and their jaws ached. One fisherman, according to a statement he gave much later, fired a shotgun behind his shed out of pure desperate anger and saw the gulls rise from the roof without hearing the blast. A 911 operator 2 towns inland would later say that calls came in from the area and then dissolved into confusion because nobody on either end seemed able to hear what the other was saying. The deputy drove from one end of town to the other, leaning on his horn until his palm hurt, watching heads turn at the movement of the truck and not at the noise it should have made. The first thing that turned the panic into something colder happened at the harbor. A group of men had gone down to the floats because several boats were coming in against the tide and not tying up properly. From the road, people saw them pointing, then waving others closer. A woman from the pharmacy later told reporters she never forgot the look on their faces. It was not surprise. It was recognition mixed with dread, the kind that comes when something impossible resembles something a person has feared for years without admitting it. In the thin green water between the pilings, the surface kept rippling outward in smooth, deliberate rings. The day was windless. Nothing visible broke the water. Yet the ripples moved from berth to berth as though something large were passing beneath the boats, pausing under one hull, then another, patient and unhurried. The lines on the moored vessels drew tight, fenders pressed and released. One skiff rocked so hard it nearly climbed the float. Not a splash was heard. Words spread in the broken, frantic way. Word always spreads in small places. People carried it with their hands, with their mouths, with the whites of their eyes. Something in the harbor. Something under the water. Something moving around the church. Something at the old Cannery Road house where no one had lived in years. A few of the stories contradicted each other within minutes, but one detail held. In the absence of sound, everyone had begun noticing movement. Curtains shifting inside empty buildings, doors resting open that had been closed, shadows crossing second-floor windows with no bodies behind them when anyone arrived to check. A delivery boy from the market swore he saw footprints appearing in the wet sand by the seawall as if made by someone walking just ahead of him. The prints were narrow and deep, each one filling slowly with black water, and they continued until they reached the granite steps behind the closed Maritime Museum. There, they simply stopped. By evening, the silence had changed the town. People no longer ran. Running felt childish against that strange dead air. They gathered instead. Families sat close in kitchens with all the lights on. Men stood in the fire station, passing notes back and forth because speech had become a habit without purpose. The church filled before sunset, not because the minister had called anyone there, but because the old building still felt like the strongest shell in town. Candles were lit, though the power had not failed. Faces turned toward the high windows each time fog brushed against the glass. Several witnesses later claimed the minister tried to ring the handbell by the altar and nearly dropped it in fright, because although no sound came from it, dust shook loose from the rafters in a widening circle, as though something above them had heard it perfectly well. After dark, the reports grew harder to separate from legend. A man watching from his upstairs window on Bay Street believed he saw figures standing at the mouth of every side road leading toward the center of town, not moving, not approaching, only waiting, shoulder to shoulder where the fog was thickest, too far off to identify and yet close enough to disturb the eye. Another resident, whose account was written down years later by a local historian, said she looked from her back porch toward the marsh and found the reeds bending in long parallel strips, not from the wind, but from pressure, as though a line of unseen bodies were making their way inland. The owner of the diner reported that every loose spoon hanging from hooks behind the counter had begun to tremble at the same time. No one heard them strike together, yet they swayed for nearly a minute. He left them there afterward. People who came into the diner in later years noticed that none of those spoons matched the others. He said he had thrown the originals into the sea. Sometime after full dark, a boy vanished for less than 10 minutes and changed the memory of that day forever. He had been in the basement of his mother's house with a flashlight, playing cards on the floor because the basement felt safer than the rooms above. When his mother looked down the stairs, he was gone. She searched the coal room, the laundry corner, the old pantry shelves, nothing. Then she found the back door to the yard standing open. Outside, the beam of the flashlight lay across the grass like a pale stick of wood. The silence held. The fog had thickened until the houses on either side were only hints of shape. She crossed the yard, calling his name to no effect, and found him at last beside the old well behind the property line, standing with his hand inside the ring of cold stones. When she pulled him away, he resisted with a strange, slow strength, never taking his eyes off the dark opening. She slapped him across the face. He blinked and seemed to return to himself. Years later, when asked what he had been doing out there, he said that during the silence, he had heard someone speaking from the well in a voice that did not use sound. It had been telling him, very politely, to wait because they were almost finished. That was the first account that made people wonder whether the silence had not been emptiness at all. Near midnight, the sound returned. Those who lived through it described no clear beginning, only the unbearable shock of ordinary noise crashing back into place. The church furnace rattled like gunfire. Someone screamed. A baby in the rectory started wailing as if it had been drawing breath for hours. Dogs erupted all at once up and down the streets. Boat lines slapped pilings. Somewhere, glass shattered. The town seemed to stagger under the weight of its own voice. Men dropped to their knees. Children clamped hands over their ears. The deputy, who had spent the afternoon driving uselessly through town, said the first thing he heard was not the horn under his hand or the engine beneath him, but the harbor, all the water in the harbor moving at once with a heavy inward rush, as if something large had just slipped beneath the surface and gone deeper. For a few minutes there was relief. People embraced. Some laughed from the strain of it, some wept openly, the phones worked, radios hissed and crackled back to life. Doors opened, lamps were switched off. It might have ended there as a story of collective fear, one of those strange local incidents that becomes a newspaper column and then a footnote and then nothing at all. Instead, the town began noticing the differences. The dog in the road finally barked, but ran from its owner and never came back. A freezer in the grocery that had remained on all afternoon now held fish gone soft and gray as if they had been left out for days. Several clocks that had kept perfect time during the silence were found stopped at the exact moment sound returned, their hands fused in place. In houses across town, small objects had changed position in ways no one could explain. Chairs faced the wrong walls, family photographs had been turned inward. One woman found every kitchen knife laid in a neat row on her table, handles aligned toward the back door. At the church, a patch of dampness spread across the sanctuary floor beneath the rafters where the dust had fallen, and the dampness smelled faintly of salt and something older, like weeds drawn from the bottom of a pond. The harbor showed the worst of it by morning. On several boats, prints had been found in the slime along the gunnels and decks, though no one agreed on what had made them. They were not bare human feet, nor boots, nor anything that local wardens could identify. They looked almost careful, narrow at the heel, long at the front, with a drag between steps as though the maker had been learning the shape of walking while it walked. One trawlerman refused ever again to take his boat out before sunrise because he found the latch to his cabin unhooked from the inside after the silence, and inside the cabin, on the table, his logbook lay open to a page he had never written. Across the blank paper ran a line pressed so deeply into the surface it tore the sheet beneath. There were no words, only the repeated motion of someone trying to teach a hand how to make them. According to townspeople who still discuss the incident years later, the unsettling part was not what happened during those lost hours, but what followed in the weeks after. Voices sounded nearly right, yet not always. A wife would turn at the sound of her husband entering the room and pause, troubled by some slight wrongness she could never describe. Children woke at night because they heard their mothers calling from downstairs, only to find their mothers asleep. A man in a parked truck near the wharf swore the local radio station once broadcast nothing but harbor sounds long after midnight, low water and rope and slow breathing, though the station had signed off hours earlier. More than one resident said the town seemed crowded after that, not with people seen clearly, but with a sense of occupancy in places that should have been empty. Hallways no longer felt empty. Closed rooms no longer felt vacant. It was as if the silence had not erased the town for several hours, but lent it to something else. No official explanation ever satisfied anyone for long. State investigators looked into equipment failure, environmental causes, even the possibility of mass suggestion brought on by some rare atmospheric event. There were clippings, there were interviews, there were careful phrases about stress and memory and the tendency of fear to reshape a community after the fact. Yet, those same clipped reports also recorded the practical details no theory explained very well. The phones that connected and did not carry sound. The animals panicking before any person seemed to understand what was wrong. The footprints on the boats, the boy at the well, the ripples moving beneath still water. The older residents, the ones who disliked reporters and trusted folklore more than specialists, spoke more quietly about it. They said the coast had stories long before there were paved roads and diesel engines and tourist maps. French sailors had written about stretches of fog that swallowed voices. Wabanaki stories, badly remembered and often repeated by people who did not understand them, were invoked in careless whispers whenever the bay turned strange. Fishermen had always carried private beliefs about what listened from beneath the hull on flat nights. The old people did not claim to know what came into town that day. They only said that silence was never truly empty. A place could go quiet because it had been abandoned, or because something was listening. Years passed, shops changed hands, storms took sections of the pier, and new boards replaced old ones. Children who had hidden in kitchens that afternoon grew up and left for Portland or Boston or farther south, and when they were asked about their hometown, they often hesitated before saying its name. Some refused to speak of the silence at all. Others told the story carefully, always as something reported, remembered, never proven. Yet on certain evenings, when the fog comes in low and the harbor loses its edges, the town still falls into a wary kind of quiet before anyone means it to. Conversations thin, people glance toward the water. The church door gets checked twice. Those who know the old story listen for the return of ordinary things: the buoy bell, the gulls, the cough of a truck climbing the hill. Because the part that lingers is not that the town once lost all sound, it is that when sound came back, nobody could shake the feeling that it had returned slightly used. The last time anyone heard from Emily Carter. The phone was not supposed to be moving anymore. By the fourth night after Emily Carter disappeared, the search teams had already walked the creek beds, the drainage ditches, the gravel roads that lifted out into the dark fields north of town. Deputies had checked the usual places first, then the less usual ones. They had spoken to the man at the gas station, the woman who claimed she saw Emily near the highway shoulder, the couple who said they heard a car door slam sometime after midnight. The public updates grew thinner with each passing day. The first photographs began to fade from storefront windows. But just after midnight, according to reports later discussed by people close to the case, Emily's phone connected to a nearby tower again. Not far away, not out in another state, not gone. Just there, somewhere in the dark, as if it had only just been switched on by a patient hand. Northern Colorado has long stretches where sound travels too clearly at night. A dog barking 3 properties over can seem close enough to touch. Wind moving through dry grass can sound like whispering in a room that should be empty. The roads outside the smaller towns run between irrigation ditches, storage sheds, old fencing, and fields that flatten under moonlight until distance becomes difficult to judge. It was in a place like that, people said, where Emily had last been seen. Not in a dramatic way, not running, not screaming, just present, and then no longer present. What could be confirmed publicly was sparse. Emily had gone missing after an ordinary evening by every outward measure. There was no sign of a struggle that authorities chose to describe in detail. Her vehicle, according to discussion that followed, was not found abandoned on some lonely road in the way people first imagined. The confusion started almost immediately. One witness said she left alone. Another said she had been arguing with someone in a parking lot lit by weak amber bulbs. A third insisted she looked calm, distracted if anything, as though listening for something outside the frame of conversation. None of it aligned cleanly. The accounts overlapped in shape and not in substance, the way stories do when people want badly to be useful and fear what their own memory might have missed. By the second day, volunteers were driving slow loops through the county roads with their windows cracked, calling her name into culverts and shelter belts and the mouths of abandoned farm buildings. Flyers went up in laundromats, diners, and feed stores. The usual machinery of concern began to turn. Family members made statements. Friends repeated the same careful phrases into local microphones. She would not have vanished on purpose. She was not the sort of person to disappear. She would have called, she would have answered. It was the kind of language people use when trying to build a wall against the dark, as if the right sequence of facts could keep something unreal from becoming permanent. Then came the first mention of the phone. Not an answered call, not a message, only a connection. A small thing, technical and bloodless on paper. Her device had reached a tower sometime late at night, then gone silent again. Searchers shifted their attention toward the area suggested by the signal. Roads were checked, empty lots were checked, water was checked, ditches were checked twice. Nothing. The ground gave back no shoe, no coat, no bag, no clean explanation. And when morning came, the land looked exactly as it had the day before. Wide and ordinary and untroubled by what people were beginning to fear it was hiding. The late-night tower connections might have remained a detail buried inside the case if they had happened only once, but according to people who followed the disappearance closely, it happened again. Then again, each time well after dark. Each time brief enough to feel accidental, deliberate, or both. The phone would appear near the same cluster of towers and then vanish before anyone could reach anything that might be called a scene. To some investigators, if reports are to be believed, it suggested movement within a limited area. To others, it suggested a device powered on intermittently by someone who knew just enough to create uncertainty. But uncertainty, once it settles into a town, does not stay professional for long. It seeps under doors, it rides home with the volunteers, it sits in kitchens after the television has gone dark. People began checking their own windows at night. A waitress from a roadside place said she had served Emily coffee earlier that week and remembered her because she kept glancing at the door as if waiting for someone who made her uneasy. A ranch hand swore he saw a light moving near an unused service road close to midnight, low to the ground at first and then higher, as if someone had lifted a phone and turned slowly in a circle. A teenager told deputies he heard a ringtone drifting over the irrigation canal while he was parked with friends, but nobody in the car agreed on what the sound had been. Even within a single memory, things were splitting apart. That was when older stories began to attach themselves to the case the way burrs catch on clothing. There are places in northern Colorado where the newest silence lies over older absences. The old farmhouses with sunken porches, the motels that stand too far from the interstate to be useful now, the barns that look empty from the road until moonlight finds glass where no glass should be. Residents always have stories, though most of them are not told in daylight. A woman gone from a service station near closing time, a hunter who left his truck and did not come back before first snow, lights seen moving through fallow fields long after the nearest house had gone dark. None of it proved anything. None of it needed to. In a place that keeps its distances, rumor becomes a second weather. Emily's case became the center these stories drifted toward. Her friends were said to be exhausted by the contradictions. One of them told a local reporter, in the careful voice of someone trying not to become part of the spectacle, that the worst part was not the not knowing, it was the false almosts. Each late-night signal felt like proof that an answer was nearby. Each morning erased it. Some nights, they stayed awake, dressed and ready, waiting to hear that searchers had found her alive in some outbuilding or stranded on some back road. Instead, there would be another clipped update, another request for tips, another statement that the investigation was active and ongoing. The language remained steady even as everyone listening to it began to hear the hollowness underneath. One volunteer, according to local discussion afterward, had driven the area of the strongest signal alone after midnight despite being asked not to. He took a county road lined with bare cottonwoods and followed it until pavement became packed dirt. There were no houses for a while, then one old place set back from the road with no porch light, no visible vehicle, and plywood over one of the windows. He later said he stopped because he thought he saw a pale rectangle moving behind the glass, bright for a second, then gone. When he rolled down his window, he heard nothing at first, except the ticking of his own engine cooling. Then, very faintly, a vibration. Not a ringtone exactly. More like a phone set to silent and left on a hard surface somewhere inside the dark. He did not go in. He told himself he was being foolish. He drove back toward town and reported it the next day, ashamed of how uncertain he sounded even to himself. By then, the phone had connected on another night. Always late, always brief, always enough. Technicians could explain the basics. A device could wake for many reasons. Battery fluctuations, environmental interference, limited handshakes with the network, delayed behavior not always meaningful to a layperson. People repeated these explanations because they needed them. But explanations only work as far as the pattern allows. This pattern did not spread out randomly across daylight hours. It did not drift county to county. It happened at night, in a narrow band of darkness, as if something waited for the town to become still before letting the signal rise. The most disturbing detail never appeared in any official release, but it survived in conversation because it had the shape of something that should not be true. According to those who claim to know, Emily's voicemail changed sometime after the disappearance, not the greeting itself, the space after it. Callers began to say there was a sound underneath the silence, so faint they first mistook it for the hiss of a poor connection. Then, one of Emily's cousins listened to it more than once and said it sounded like wind passing through a narrow opening with a hollow knock at uneven intervals, as though something loose were striking wood somewhere nearby. Another person insisted there was breathing, another said they heard water. Each listener found a different horror inside the same static. That may have been grief, it may have been suggestion, but after that, some family friends stopped calling altogether. The witness statements only grew stranger as they were repeated. The woman who believed she had seen Emily by the highway later said she was no longer sure it had been Emily at all, only someone with the same light jacket and the same habit of holding one arm close to her body when cold. The couple who reported a car door after midnight began arguing over whether the sound had actually been farther away than they first claimed. The man at the gas station changed one detail in a way that unsettled everyone who noticed. At first, he said Emily looked tired. Later, he said she looked as though she had been crying. Then, in a quieter interview that circulated among locals more than it aired publicly, he said she had looked frightened for only a second and that the fear had not been directed at anyone in the store. It had been aimed through the front window toward the darkness outside. No suspect was clearly named in the public imagination because the facts would not stay still long enough to support one. That left room for the older American habit of filling blank spaces with place, with atmosphere, with whatever had frightened the town before this latest absence arrived. People pointed to the isolated structures beyond the main roads. They spoke of storage units, disused farm equipment, sheds, hunting cabins no one checked until deep winter. Some remembered older cases from other states, stories of missing people whose belongings lingered longer in the landscape than their bodies did. Others spoke more softly, and only at home, about the way certain roads seemed to collect trouble. A person could drive them 100 times in daylight and feel nothing. Then, one night, the same road would seem to turn its face and show some other character entirely. Searchers kept going. They searched by morning and by dusk. They searched on foot and in vehicles. They searched places no one wanted to search. The weather shifted in small Colorado ways, cold enough before dawn to sting the lungs, then thin sunlight over the fields, then evening coming on too quickly. Boots pressed new patterns into mud that dried and cracked by the next day. Tape fluttered where officers had marked off areas and then, once cleared, removed themselves from them. In photographs taken from the roadside, the landscape looked open. Standing inside it was different. Inside it, every ditch had depth. Every cluster of trees held shadow long after the rest of the ground had gone pale. A deputy was said to have remarked, off the record and long after, that the worst searches were the ones conducted in nearly complete silence. Not because silence was eerie in itself, but because it changed the rhythm of expectation. A person walking through brush begins to hear every small disturbance as meaningful. A scrape becomes a footstep. A bird lifting out of weeds becomes movement. The mind begins to prepare for discovery over and over, and each time it finds only more land. Emily's search, by those accounts, had that feeling. Not dramatic, not cinematic. Only prolonged, cold disappointment broken at intervals by the tiny cruelty of electronic hope. Then a rancher reported seeing a light. He was closing a gate not far from one of the tower areas when he noticed a glow in the distance, low and blue-white, blinking between stands of scrub. He assumed at first it was another volunteer, though by then official searches had been scaled back at night. The light vanished, reappeared farther along, vanished again. He called out once, no answer. By the time he reached the fence line nearest the glow, it was gone. He later said what unsettled him most was not the distance or the darkness, but the height of it. Too low for someone walking with a flashlight. About right, he thought afterward, for a phone being carried loosely at thigh level. After that report, people began keeping track of the time. Just after midnight. A little before 1 a.m., closer to 2 on one occasion, depending on which account was believed. The pattern narrowed into ritual. It was as if Emily's disappearance had not ended in a single moment, but was still occurring in fragments every night. A signal, a light, a sound, then nothing by dawn. Emily's mother, according to people close to the family, stopped sleeping in her bedroom and moved to the living room sofa because it was nearer the front window. She did not say she expected Emily to come walking up the driveway. She was too practical for language like that. But practical people also leave lamps on for reasons they do not discuss. She kept her phone on the coffee table with the sound turned high. She answered every unknown number. Sometimes she would wake certain she had heard the vibration of a call and find the screen dark. the room washed in that thin pre-dawn color that makes furniture look abandoned. Once, very late, she reportedly received a burst of silence long enough to make her say Emily's name twice into the line before the connection dropped. Whether it was a real event, a wrong number, or a story changed by repetition is impossible to say. In missing person cases, grief does not merely remember, it edits. The house Emily had left behind became another quiet center of the case. Friends came and went at first, gathering clothes, feeding pets if there were pets, checking drawers for anything that might help. Later, the visits slowed. The rooms settled. A cup remained where it had been set down. A charger stayed plugged into the wall with nothing attached to it. Shoes waited by a door that no longer opened for the person who had worn them. It is often the ordinary objects that make a disappearance feel least survivable. Not blood, not drama. Just a brush with hair still caught in it, a receipt folded into a coat pocket, the pale square on a nightstand where a phone used to charge before someone took it into the dark. Weeks passed, if later retellings are accurate, without the case becoming clearer. Public interest rose and fell. The flyers weathered. Tape marks on certain windows faded. New events in other places pulled attention away, but local memory held on to the tower connections because they resisted the comfort of finality. If Emily's phone had gone dead at once, people could have folded that fact into the bleak arithmetic of disappearance. Instead, it kept returning like a hand on the shoulder after everyone in the room had gone still. There was one more detail, not official, not proved, but repeated often enough that it survives wherever the case is mentioned in low voices. A utility worker doing routine checks near one of the tower zones found an old outbuilding on private land with fresh scuff marks near the threshold. Nothing dramatic, no obvious sign of forced entry. Just the feeling that the door had been opened recently despite the dust and weather on the rest of the structure. He did not go in at first because the smell coming through the gap was stale and mineral, damp wood, and cold earth. When he returned later with the property owner, the inside held only old equipment, broken shelving, and a workbench. On the bench lay a phone charger with no phone attached to it. The model was common. It proved nothing. But the owner swore it had not been there the season before. No public account ever confirmed that the charger belonged to Emily. No public statement ever tied the tower signals to a specific place. That is where truth begins to fray into the darker fabric people make to cover what they cannot bear to leave exposed. Some say investigators knew more than they released and withheld it for reasons of procedure. Some say the signals were meaningless and the town built a ghost from network noise because grief prefers a moving target to a permanent grave. Others, more quietly, say the phone was being powered on by someone who liked the idea of nearness. Someone who wanted the search to circle without landing. Someone who understood how much terror could be created by a device no larger than a hand. What remains, years later, in the way such stories are told, is not a solved ending, but a schedule of dread. Midnight settling over the county roads, empty fields silvered by moonlight, barns and sheds standing dark against the horizon, a family home with one lamp burning, search volunteers who once thought technology would bring certainty, now staring at maps that only tightened the mystery. And somewhere in that wide northern dark, according to reports and rumors that never fully died, a phone waking just long enough to remind everyone that Emily Carter had not simply vanished. Something, or someone, had lingered after her. Even now, locals sometimes mention that the roads around those tower zones feel wrong after midnight, not haunted in the theatrical sense, just watched, as if the land there learned the habit of waiting. Drivers passing through say they lower the radio without meaning to. They check the passenger seat for a light that is not there, they notice how often they look toward the fields, and if their own phones lose service for a moment or vibrate once without explanation, they think of the case whether they want to or not. Because the last time anyone was certain they heard from Emily Carter was not a voice, not a cry for help, not a message that could be saved and replayed. It was only a brief, cold acknowledgement from the dark. a signal touching a tower in the middle of the night, then slipping away before anyone could reach it. The kind of thing that would have meant almost nothing in another case. In this one, it was enough to keep the town listening long after the sound was gone. A Northern California cabin had a door that opened from inside. The sound was unmistakable. It was the heavy, metallic thud of a steel deadbolt sliding into place, followed by the definitive click of the locking mechanism. Thomas stood motionless on the rotting wooden porch, the freezing rain dripping from the brim of his hat. He was entirely alone, 20 miles from the nearest paved road. He stared at the weathered oak door of the cabin. His own right hand was still holding the brass key, having just secured the exterior padlock seconds ago. Yet, someone or something inside the dark, windowless cabin had just thrown the inner latch, effectively locking him out. It was late November of 1996. The isolated parcel of land sat deep within the ancient, dripping forests of Mendocino County. Thomas was a county appraiser tasked with evaluating the abandoned estate of a man named Arthur Vance. According to local records, Vance had walked away from his property 6 years earlier, driving to the county sheriff's office and handing over a ring of heavy iron keys. The man had refused to speak of the cabin, only stating that the property was no longer his and that no one should ever go back there after sundown. The journey to the property that morning had been an exercise in isolation. As Thomas had navigated his truck off the main highway and onto the unmarked dirt logging roads, the towering redwoods had seemed to close in around him, their massive trunks blocking out the pale autumn sunlight. The local radio station had dissolved into a haze of white static miles ago. The deeper he drove into the forested hills, the quieter the world became. By the time he reached the rusted iron gate marking the property line, the silence was almost deafening, broken only by the steady drum of rain against his windshield. Thomas had heard the rumors, of course. Small towns always held on to stories of eccentric hermits and cursed land, but Thomas was a man of measurements, property lines, and tax codes. He had arrived at the cabin at 2 p.m, armed with a clipboard and a heavy flashlight. The structure itself was an anomaly. It was built from massive, untreated pine logs, but it completely lacked windows. The only point of entry was the single, solid oak door at the front, reinforced with thick iron bands and fitted with an absurd number of locks on both the inside and the outside. When Thomas had first unlocked the door and stepped inside earlier that afternoon, the air had tasted stale, metallic, and incredibly heavy. His flashlight beam had cut through thick, suspended dust, revealing a single, massive room. There was no furniture, there was no stove. There were only bare wooden floorboards sloping inexplicably toward the exact center of the room. In the corners, thousands of dead, desiccated flies were swept into neat, deliberate piles. The atmosphere had been so intensely oppressive that Thomas had found it difficult to draw a full breath, as if the room itself was actively rejecting his presence. By 4:30 p.m., the pale winter sun had dipped behind the towering redwoods, plunging the forest into a deep, premature twilight. A heavy, freezing rain had begun to fall. Thomas had decided to end his inspection early, eager to escape the suffocating air of the cabin. He had stepped out onto the porch, pulled the heavy oak door shut, and threaded a thick steel chain through the exterior iron hasps, securing it with a heavy brass padlock. He had turned the key, satisfied that the structure was completely sealed. And that was when he heard it. The unmistakable sound of the interior deadbolt sliding shut. Thomas stood on the porch, his hand resting on the wet iron chain. He leaned his ear against the damp wood of the door. He held his breath, straining to hear any movement from within. There was only silence, the heavy, dead silence of an empty room. He stepped back slowly, the rain plastering his hair to his forehead. There was no other way into the structure. No windows, no cellar doors, no gaps in the heavy log roof. Whatever had thrown that deadbolt was trapped inside. Or, Thomas thought with a sudden chill, it had simply wanted to ensure that Thomas stayed outside. He slowly backed down the wooden steps, his boots sinking into the muddy ground, keeping his eyes fixed on the blank wooden door until he reached the safety of his truck. Thomas climbed into the cab, locking the doors and turning the ignition just enough to run the heater. The digital clock on the dashboard read 5:15 p.m. He wiped the condensation from the inside of the windshield, peering through the driving rain at the dark shape of the cabin. The wind picked up, violently thrashing the branches of the surrounding pines, but the cabin stood immovable, a black void against the gray trees. Hours dragged by in agonizing slowness. The rain transitioned into a steady, freezing mist. By midnight, Thomas had managed to drift into a shallow, uneasy sleep, his head resting against the cold glass of the driver's side window. He was awakened abruptly by a sound that cut cleanly through the white noise of the weather. It was a low, rhythmic thud. It sounded like heavy, deliberate footsteps pacing back and forth across the hollow floorboards of the cabin. Thomas sat up slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked toward the structure. It was barely visible in the heavy fog that had rolled in from the coast. The thudding continued. 4 steps in one direction. A pause. 4 steps back. The sound was immense, carrying a weight that seemed far too heavy for a human being. The thick floorboards inside creaked and groaned in protest with every single step. His trembling hand reached for the headlight switch. He pulled it. The high beams violently illuminated the clearing, casting stark, shifting shadows against the front of the cabin. The instant the harsh yellow light struck the weathered wood of the door, the pacing stopped entirely. The silence that followed was immediate, unnatural, and suffocating. Thomas stared at the heavy door, watching the fog drift through the beams of light. For 10 long minutes, absolutely nothing happened. He considered putting the truck in gear and driving back down the muddy access road, abandoning the assessment entirely. But the twisting, unpaved logging road was treacherous in the daylight and practically a death trap in a freezing midnight fog. He had no choice but to sit in the cold truck and wait for morning. He reached out and pushed the headlight switch back in. The clearing plunged into absolute darkness once more. Almost immediately, the brass doorknob of the cabin began to rattle. Thomas could hear it clearly over the howling wind. The knob was turning frantically, twisting left and right as if unseen hands were violently shaking it. Then came the sound of heavy fists hammering against the inside of the wood, a frantic, desperate pounding that shook the entire frame of the building. According to the official county records filed weeks later, the physical mechanics of what happened next were entirely impossible. The cabin door was constructed to swing inward. It rested against a thick, load-bearing wooden frame that prevented it from opening outward under any circumstances. Furthermore, Thomas had secured the outside with a heavy steel chain, and the interior deadbolt was firmly locked in place. The heavy thudding against the wood suddenly changed into a steady, agonizing groan. Thomas turned the headlights back on, his hands shaking violently. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. The heavy oak door was bowing outward. It was curving toward the porch under the strain of an immense, unseen pressure from within. The thick iron hinges were screaming in the cold air, the metal bending as the solid wood was pushed slowly, impossibly, in the completely wrong direction. The steel chain Thomas had wrapped around the exterior hasps pulled taut, grinding against the rusted iron. The door continued to bulge outward, the wood splintering along the center seam. Thomas watched, paralyzed by a deep, primal terror, as the heavy frame of the cabin began to crack under the strain. The sound of rending wood echoed through the dark forest, loud and sharp like cannon fire. With a deafening snap, the interior deadbolt sheared completely off its mountings. A second later, the exterior steel chain exploded, the padlock tearing cleanly through the rusted iron hasp. The heavy oak door burst violently outward, ripping entirely free from its twisted hinges and crashing down onto the wet wooden porch with a massive thud. Thomas slammed his back against the driver's seat, his eyes wide, waiting for whatever had been inside to emerge into the harsh light of his high beams. He stared at the gaping black rectangle of the doorway. The interior of the cabin was an impenetrable well of darkness, a void that seemed to swallow the light from his truck. He waited for a shape, a shadow, a movement. He waited for hours. Nothing ever came out. The rest of the night passed in a state of suspended terror. Thomas did not lower his eyes from the open doorway. He did not turn off the headlights until the battery began to die. As the first gray light of morning finally began to bleed through the canopy of the redwoods, the thick fog slowly dissipated. The forest was entirely still. The cabin stood silent in the pale morning light, its front torn open like a jagged wound. Sometime around 8 in the morning, Thomas finally found the strength to unlock his truck door. His legs were completely numb as he walked slowly across the muddy clearing toward the porch. He stepped over the shattered remains of the heavy steel chain, the brass padlock lying mangled in the dirt. He slowly approached the porch and looked down at the heavy oak door lying on the wet wood. The exterior of the door was battered and weathered from decades of exposure to the elements, but as Thomas carefully stepped over it to look at the interior side, his blood ran completely cold. The inside of the door was completely smooth. There were no scratch marks, there were no dents, there was absolutely no evidence that anything had struck, pushed, or hammered against the wood from the inside. The heavy iron latch of the deadbolt was still fully extended, having been snapped off by sheer blunt force. Trembling, Thomas raised his heavy flashlight and aimed it into the open doorway of the cabin. The pale beam swept across the bare, slanting floorboards. The neat piles of dead flies in the corners were completely undisturbed. But what haunted Thomas, and what would eventually force him to abandon his career entirely, was the dust. The thick, gray layer of dust coating the floor of the cabin was perfectly even, pristine, and entirely unbroken. Not a single footprint marked the floor, nothing had walked across the room to slide the deadbolt shut the evening before, nothing had paced back and forth in the darkness during the night, and nothing had pressed against the heavy oak door to force it open. The structure had simply locked itself, held its breath in the dark, and then violently torn itself open from the inside out. Local residents still refuse to hunt in that specific section of the Mendocino woods. The abandoned property remains entirely unsold. According to local hunters, who occasionally wander too close to the property line, the cabin is still standing, slowly rotting away into the forest floor. They say that on quiet winter nights, if you stand near the rusted iron gate, you can hear the distinct sound of heavy, dragging footsteps pacing back and forth in the darkness, waiting patiently for someone to bring a new door and try to lock it again. The Midnight Choir of Waverly Hills. On a high wooded ridge in southwestern Louisville, Kentucky, a decaying Gothic monolith bleeds into the night sky. Waverly Hills Sanatorium stands as a sprawling, bat-winged fortress of dark brick and shattered glass. The structure is massive, dominating the landscape with a heavy, oppressive stillness. It is a place where time ceased to move decades ago, yet the physical residue of immense human suffering never truly evaporated from its halls. The wind that pulls through the empty window frames does not merely whistle, it wheezes, dragging across the cracked plaster like breath through a ruined trachea. To understand the atmosphere of Waverly Hills is to understand the White Plague. In the early 20th century, tuberculosis was a death sentence that arrived as a slow, suffocating thief. By 1926, the massive 5-story sanatorium was opened to accommodate the overwhelming tide of the afflicted. It was designed as an island of quarantine, a place where the sick were sent to either recover through experimental fresh air therapies or, far more often, to die in isolation. Patients were subjected to brutal treatments, ribs were surgically removed to collapse infected lungs, and heavy sandbags were placed on chests. The sheer volume of mortality was staggering. It is estimated that up to 60,000 souls took their final, agonizing breaths within these walls. The bodies became so numerous that a motorized cable system was installed in a concrete tunnel stretching 400 feet down the hill. This became known as the body chute, a grim artery designed to transport the dead away quietly, out of sight of the living whose morale was already fracturing. Today, the building is a hollow shell, stripped of its medical equipment and abandoned to the elements. Yet, those who are tasked with walking its long, cavernous corridors at night understand that Waverly Hills is not empty. It is saturated. The caretakers and night guards who patrol the sprawling wards do not speak of traditional hauntings. They do not report transparent figures in period clothing. Instead, they describe a terrifying environmental playback, a phenomenon where the building itself seems to regurgitate the sensory horrors of its past. The auditory terror usually begins deep in the night, often reported around 2:30 a.m., when the ambient noise of the surrounding city has completely faded. A lone guard walking the central corridor of the fourth floor will first notice a severe drop in air pressure. The atmosphere grows heavy, thick with a metallic scent that closely resembles old dried copper. It is the distinct, unmistakable smell of blood. The temperature plummets rapidly, mimicking the cold, damp sweat of a breaking fever. Then, the silence is broken by a single, wet sound. It starts as a low, guttural click at the far end of the pitch-black hallway, a sharp intake of air followed by a wet, heavy cough. The sound is highly localized, echoing off the peeling lead paint and the chipped terrazzo floors. It sounds exactly like a human being struggling to clear a massive obstruction from their throat. Before the mind can rationalize the sound as a trick of the wind or settling pipes, a second cough joins in from an adjacent empty room. Then a third, emanating from the shadows directly behind the listener. Within moments, the isolated sounds cascade into a horrific symphony. It is a phenomenon known among the night staff as the midnight choir. Dozens, then hundreds of invisible throats begin to spasm simultaneously. It is the terrible, unmistakable sound of the death rattle, the final stage of respiratory failure, where fluid pools in the lungs and the failing throat loses its ability to swallow. The acoustics of the long, tiled corridors amplify the noise until it becomes a deafening roar. It is the sound of an entire hospital ward drowning on dry land. Caretakers have reported dropping to their knees, clutching their ears to block out the overwhelming auditory assault of hundreds of phantom patients choking on their own dissolving lungs. The noise vibrates in the sternum. It feels entirely physical, a crushing wave of collective agony that demands to be heard. It is during this crescendo of auditory panic that the visual terror manifests. The human brain, overwhelmed by the deafening sound of unseen suffocation, frantically commands the eyes to search for the source. The beam of a heavy flashlight cuts through the dust-moted air, sweeping wildly across the empty beds and the graffiti-stained walls. But the threat does not walk on the floor. High above, pressed flat against the decaying ceiling plaster, a shape detaches itself from the darkness. It is an entity known only in the whispered lore of the property as the Creeper. The flashlight beam reveals a sprawling, ink-black silhouette roughly the size of a human, but its proportions are entirely wrong. Its limbs are elongated, spindly, and bent at impossible spider-like angles. It defies gravity, clinging to the smooth ceiling above the hallway with an unnatural tension. The Creeper does not float. It crawls. It moves with the rapid, twitching locomotion of an insect, scuttling across the ceiling tiles at a terrifying speed. As the choir of choking patients echoes endlessly through the ward, the shadowed entity darts from archway to archway, using the deep corners of the high ceilings to mask its approach. It makes no sound of its own, fully concealed by the deafening roar of the phantom coughing. Witnesses describe a paralyzing sense of predatory intent radiating from the shape. It descends the walls only to reposition itself, moving so fast that the eye can barely track its progression before it melds back into the blackness above. It is a manifestation of pure, predatory dread, feeding off the residual energy of the suffering that permeates the brickwork. Those who encounter the midnight choir and the crawling shadow do not investigate further. The only rational response is retreat. Guards report backing away slowly, keeping their flashlight beams trained on the ceiling until they reach the heavy steel doors of the main stairwell. The descent down the concrete steps is always frantic, driven by the suffocating need to escape the heavy, diseased air of the upper floors. The sounds of the collective death rattle only begin to muffle once the heavy exterior doors are pushed open, allowing the freezing night air of the Kentucky woods to hit the face. But the silence outside never truly erases the experience. The trauma of the encounter lingers long after the shift ends. Those who walk the halls of Waverly Hills learn a grim reality about the nature of a haunting. The sanatorium is not simply a structure occupied by restless spirits. It is a massive architectural phonograph needle permanently stuck in the deepest groove of human agony, playing back the horrific reality of the White Plague to anyone unfortunate enough to listen in the dark. A Banff hiker was found days later with no memory of the trail. When the heavy beam of a commercial transport truck cut through the freezing fog along a desolate stretch of Highway 1, it was just past 3 in the morning. The driver had not seen another vehicle for over 40 miles. The surrounding forests of the Canadian Rockies were swallowed by absolute pitch black, pressing in tightly against the narrow ribbon of asphalt. As the truck rounded a sweeping curve, the headlights washed over a lone figure standing precariously close to the white shoulder line. The driver instinctively hit the brakes, the heavy tires hissing against the damp road. The figure was not waving for help. He was a man, standing perfectly rigid, facing the dense and impenetrable tree line rather than the highway. He was shivering violently in a heavy canvas winter coat that was easily 3 sizes too large for his frame. The truck driver, gripped by a sudden and inexplicable sense of dread, did not open his cabin door. Instead, he locked it, rolled his window down just a fraction of an inch, and called the authorities. When the provincial police arrived 20 minutes later, they recognized the shivering man almost immediately from a high-priority missing persons bulletin issued 4 days earlier. He was the experienced mountaineer who had vanished without a trace from a remote alpine trail in Banff National Park, over 130 miles away. But when the officers wrapped a thick blanket around his shoulders and gently asked for his name, the man simply stared through them. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and entirely hollow as he whispered that he was still in the woods. According to the official search and rescue logs, the 32-year-old man had embarked on a carefully planned 3-day solo trek near the rugged Sawback Range. He was not an amateur. He was a seasoned outdoorsman who carried a satellite emergency beacon, detailed topographical maps protected in waterproof casing, and enough high-calorie provisions to comfortably last a week. His detailed itinerary was filed with park rangers, outlining a precise route that followed well-worn valleys and challenging alpine passes. For the first 48 hours of his journey, everything appeared entirely normal. Then, without warning, his satellite beacon ceased transmitting. It did not send a distress signal. The digital ping simply vanished from the monitoring grid at exactly 11:15 p.m. When a specialized search and rescue team finally reached his last known coordinates 2 days later, the scene they discovered left them deeply unsettled. His isolated camp was perfectly intact. His heavy, weatherproof tent was securely pitched beneath a canopy of old-growth pines. His 0-degree sleeping bag was neatly unrolled, and a small, portable camp stove sat cold next to a carefully constructed fire pit. Most disturbing of all were his heavy, mud-caked hiking boots. They were sitting neatly side by side just inside the zippered tent flap. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no aggressive animal tracks, and no scattered gear to indicate panic. The undisturbed scene suggested a deeply unnatural narrative. It looked as though the man had calmly unzipped his tent in the middle of the freezing night, stood up in his thick woolen socks, and walked purposefully out into the sprawling, silent wilderness. Finding the missing hiker alive should have been a moment of profound relief for the rescue teams, but the physical condition in which he was discovered only caused the mystery to deepen into something much darker. The sheer distance between his abandoned campsite and the icy stretch of highway where he was found spanned roughly 130 miles of unforgiving terrain. It was a brutal landscape of jagged, unnamed peaks, deep ravines, and freezing, fast-moving rivers. It was a journey that would have taken a fully equipped, highly trained expedition team over a week to traverse on foot. Yet, the man had seemingly covered that impossible distance in under 4 days. More baffling and deeply disturbing were the bottoms of his feet. Despite leaving his protective boots at the campsite, his bare soles were entirely pristine. There were no deep lacerations from the sharp scree fields, no pine needles embedded in his skin, and no signs of severe frostbite from the freezing alpine temperatures. He had allegedly walked over 100 miles through the harsh Canadian wilderness without shoes, yet his feet looked as though he had been resting indoors. Furthermore, the oversized, stained winter coat he was found wearing bore a faded embroidered logo from a regional logging company. According to public records, that specific logging company had filed for bankruptcy and ceased all operations in 1998. The hiker possessed absolutely no memory of where he acquired the heavy coat, how he crossed the impassable mountain ranges, or why he had abandoned his own shelter. Medical professionals at the regional hospital noted that his physical vitals were bizarrely, almost impossibly stable. He was not suffering from severe dehydration, and his core body temperature and blood sugar levels were entirely within normal limits, heavily suggesting he had eaten and rested recently. But his mind was trapped behind a thick, impenetrable wall of fog. When attending physicians gently pushed him to recount any detail from the last 4 days, his resting heart rate would immediately spike to dangerous erratic levels. He would squeeze his eyes shut, dig his fingernails into the rigid plastic edges of his hospital bed, and describe an overwhelming sensation of heavy pressure, comparing it to the feeling of being trapped at the lightless bottom of a deep lake. He told attending psychiatrists that the last normal event he could vividly remember was sitting by his unlit campfire around 8 o'clock in the evening, listening to the bitter wind move through the high pine branches. Then, according to his fractured, halting recollections, the wind completely died. He claimed that the natural ambient sounds of the forest, the chirping insects, the rustling underbrush, the distant rush of glacial water, all ceased at the exact same moment. In their place came a low, continuous, vibrating hum that seemed to echo from beneath the soil, a sound so deep it made his teeth ache and his vision blur. Hoping to construct a timeline of his movements, investigators retrieved the man's digital camera from the side pocket of his discarded backpack at the campsite. They transported the memory card to a lab, hoping the photographs might provide a rational explanation for his sudden disappearance. The first 30 pictures on the card were entirely unremarkable, showcasing sprawling, sunlit mountain vistas, gray rock faces, and clear blue skies typical of a Banff hiking trip. But the final series of images, captured on the night he vanished, defied any logical explanation. There were exactly 14 photographs taken in rapid, frantic succession at 2:14 in the morning. At first glance, the images were mostly pitch black, violently out of focus, and marred by strange, thick digital artifacts. But as photo analysts slowly adjusted the exposure and contrast levels in a darkened lab, vague, deeply unsettling shapes began to emerge from the digital noise. The massive pine trees in the background appeared heavily distorted, as if the thick wooden trunks were bending at impossible, unnatural angles toward the lens of the camera. In the final 3 photographs, the dense, suffocating canopy of pine needles overhead was faintly illuminated by an unnatural pale gray light that cast no shadows. The distinct, reflective outline of the hiker's tent was nowhere to be seen in any of the frames. Digital metadata extracted from the files indicated that these final photos were captured deep within a valley nearly 20 miles away from where the physical camera was actually found. The hiker remained in a secure psychiatric ward under close medical observation for over 2 weeks. During that extended period, his missing memories did not naturally return, but highly specific, disturbing behavioral tics began to surface. Night shift nurses reported in their charts that the man would wake from a dead sleep at exactly 2:14 in the morning every single night, without fail. He would immediately pull his knees tightly to his chest, press the palms of his hands fiercely over his ears, and stare blankly at the acoustic ceiling tiles. When a night orderly once cautiously approached and asked him what was wrong, the man did not look away from the ceiling. He merely whispered that the trees outside the window were too quiet, and that the sky behind the clouds was the wrong color. During his daily therapy sessions, he claimed that during his lost days, he had walked through a sprawling, ancient forest where the shadows cast by the trees did not match the position of the sun. He spoke in a monotone voice about a hidden valley that did not exist on any topographical map, a place where the jagged rocks felt strangely warm to the bare touch, and the stagnant air smelled heavily of ozone and burning copper. He adamantly insisted that he had not walked the 130 miles to the highway. Instead, he claimed the dark woods had simply shifted and rotated around him, rearranging their geography in an endless maze until they finally spat him out onto the cold asphalt. The most deeply unsettling revelation came during a routine cognitive mapping test in his third week of observation. A specialist asked the man to draw a simple map of his planned route on a large sheet of paper, hoping the physical, repetitive act of tracing his steps might unlock a suppressed memory fragment. The hiker calmly took the black pen and began to sketch the Sawback Range with surprising, practiced accuracy. He drew the winding trail, the river crossings, and the exact location of his final campsite. But as his pen reached the perimeter of the camp, his hand began to tremble violently. He drew a tight, jagged, aggressive circle around the campsite. He pressed the ballpoint pen down so hard that the thick paper tore, furiously filling the circle with dense, chaotic scribbles of black ink until the pen ran dry. When the specialist carefully asked him what the dark void represented, the man stopped drawing entirely. His breathing grew terribly shallow. He looked up, his eyes hollow, exhausted, and filled with a profound terror, and stated softly that it was the place where the geography finally ran out. He told her that on that night, he had walked a few yards into the trees to investigate a strange, metallic sound, but when he turned around to go back to the safety of his tent, the trail was simply gone. It was not hidden by brush or darkness, it was completely erased from the earth. He said he kept walking in a straight line for what felt like years, but the massive tree trunks merely repeated themselves, forming an endless, looping corridor of identical bark and dead silence, trapped beneath a flat sky that held absolutely no stars. To this day, the bizarre case remains officially classified by the authorities as a severe incident of temporary dissociative amnesia, likely brought on by exposure to the elements or an acute psychological break. The investigative file was quietly closed, with officials concluding that the man must have somehow hitched a ride on a private logging road to cover the impossible physical distance, despite the glaring fact that no driver ever came forward and his feet bore no signs of travel. The hiker never returned to the Canadian Rockies. According to distant relatives, he relocated to a flat, arid desert region in the American Southwest, choosing a home miles away from any large trees or heavy foliage. But the veteran park rangers who patrol the deep, isolated valleys of Banff still whisper about the abandoned campsite near the Sawback Range. They say that on certain still, moonless nights, the natural, comforting sounds of the alpine woods simply drop away without warning, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating, and unnatural silence. And those who intimately know the persistent legend of the lost hiker know better than to step off the marked trail in the dark, driven by a quiet, lingering fear that the ancient trees might quietly close in behind them, leading them into a silent space where time, distance, and memory simply cease to exist. The Curse of the Black Hope Horror. The air in southeast Texas holds a specific kind of suffocating weight during the late summer months. In the quiet town of Crosby, just a short drive outside the sprawling concrete of Houston, the trees hang low, heavy with Spanish moss, casting long, fractured shadows across manicured lawns. In the early 1980s, the Newport subdivision was pitched to eager buyers as an idyllic escape from the noise and grime of the city. It offered pristine cul-de-sacs, large backyards, and the quiet, comforting promise of the American dream. Families moved into freshly built brick homes, planting bright flower beds and pouring thick concrete for backyard patios. But the lush green grass of this new community concealed a horrific truth. The pristine houses of Newport were not built on empty land. They were anchored directly into a desecrated graveyard. Decades before the first bulldozer broke the topsoil, the densely forested area was known to locals as the Black Hope Cemetery. It was a humble, deeply sacred resting place for African American families, many of whom were the descendants of freed slaves who had settled in Harris County in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Because the community possessed little wealth, the graves were rarely marked with heavy stone monuments that could withstand the passage of time. Instead, they were indicated by simple wooden crosses, hand-carved stones, and quiet, deliberate depressions in the earth. When wealthy developers purchased the tract of land, these subtle, fading markers of the dead were callously ignored. The ancient trees were cleared, the earth was leveled, and foundations were poured directly over the remains of hundreds of sleeping souls. There was no respectful relocation of the bodies. There was no acknowledgement of the history. There was only the quiet, violent erasure of generations buried beneath fresh asphalt and bright green lawns. The horror that unfolded in the Newport subdivision did not announce itself with grand, cinematic apparitions or floating sheets. It began as a slow, creeping rot that infected the daily lives of the residents. It was the profound, unsettling feeling that the ground itself was violently rejecting their presence. In the early days of their residency, families began to notice strange, inexplicable occurrences that defied the bounds of logic and nature. The earth beneath their feet seemed to actively rebel against the weight of the new houses. Homeowners awoke to find their pristine living spaces invaded by sudden, biblical plagues of insects. Swarms of fire ants, numbering in the tens of thousands, would suddenly boil up from microscopic cracks in the foundation. They flooded living rooms, kitchens, and children's bedrooms in thick, moving carpets of red, stinging fury. Professional exterminators were entirely baffled, spraying gallons of toxic poison that did absolutely nothing to stem the relentless crawling tide. The ants would vanish as quickly as they appeared, only to be replaced by aggressive, venomous snakes finding their way through plumbing lines and floorboards, as if the soil was desperately trying to flush the living out of their homes. The rejection extended beyond the natural world, infecting the very energy and structure of the houses. It became a real-life manifestation of an extreme poltergeist, driven by a deeply rooted, collective anger from beneath the soil. Electronics behaved with destructive, malicious independence. In the dead of night, usually around 3 a.m., televisions would ignite to life by themselves. The volume would scream at maximum capacity, filling the dark living rooms with violent static, before the heavy glass screens would crack and shatter outward under immense, unseen pressure. The sharp, metallic smell of burning ozone and melting plastic would linger in the hallways for hours. Light bulbs exploded in their fixtures without warning, showering kitchens and beds with jagged glass. Heavy appliances, like refrigerators and washing machines, would inexplicably short-circuit and catch fire, threatening to burn the timber frames to the ground. Clocks would spin erratically or stop dead, freezing at random intervals and leaving the exhausted residents completely unmoored from the passage of time. Solid wooden doors would slam shut with enough force to splinter their frames, while the distinct, heavy rhythm of invisible footsteps echoed through empty corridors when residents knew they were entirely alone. The true, horrifying nature of their neighborhood was literally unearthed when the Haney family decided to build a swimming pool in their backyard. As the heavy machinery bit deep into the dark Texas soil, the steel teeth of the backhoe scraped against something remarkably hard. It was not a stubborn tree root, nor a buried rock. It was the rotting, splintered wood of a collapsed coffin. As the frantic digging continued, the grim reality of their property was exposed to the daylight. They found human bones, they found decaying burial shrouds. They eventually uncovered the distinct, identifiable graves of two individuals, Betty and Charlie Thomas, whose resting places had been paved over without a second thought by the construction crews. The discovery sent a shockwave of absolute terror through the community. The residents finally understood why their homes felt so fundamentally wrong, so steeped in malice. They were not just occupying a house, they were trespassing on a massive, forgotten tomb. The final, most devastating phase of the Black Hope curse was not structural or electrical, it was deeply, fatally biological. As the years progressed through the 1980s and into the 1990s, an alarming, inexplicable wave of severe illness swept through the subdivision. It was as if the disturbed earth was exhaling a slow, invisible, and malicious poison into the floorboards of the homes. Healthy, vibrant neighbors began to fall ill with terrifying suddenness. Rare, highly aggressive forms of cancer struck down young parents and elderly residents alike, consuming them in a matter of mere months. People who had never experienced a single day of heart trouble suffered massive, fatal cardiac arrests in their own living rooms, collapsing dead before the paramedics could even be dispatched. A heavy, suffocating blanket of grief and panic descended upon the once promising streets. In some concentrated clusters of the neighborhood, nearly every single home experienced a premature death, a severe psychological breakdown, or a catastrophic physical illness. The residents felt like they were being systematically hunted by the land they claimed to own. The soil was demanding a brutal toll, extracting the life force of the intruders to compensate for the arrogant desecration of its original inhabitants. Driven to the edge of madness and financial ruin, many families tried to flee, but escaping the Black Hope horror was not a simple task. Word of the cursed subdivision spread rapidly throughout Harris County, plummeting property values to practically nothing. Families found themselves trapped in expensive mortgages for homes they were too terrified to sleep in and too bankrupt to abandon. Some simply packed whatever fit into their cars in the middle of the night and drove away, leaving their front doors wide open and their houses to rot, foreclosed, and empty. Those who were forced by financial circumstance to stay lived in a state of perpetual, agonizing dread, waiting for the next light bulb to shatter, the next swarm of insects to rise from the floorboards, or the next fatal diagnosis to arrive. Today, the Newport subdivision still stands. New families, often completely unaware of the dark, tragic history buried beneath their feet, move in, drawn by affordable prices and quiet streets. But the air still holds that familiar, suffocating weight. The earth remains incredibly restless, serving as a grim, silent reminder that the dead demand respect, and that some ground will never, ever forgive the violent trespasses of the living. Montana Rangers logged the same signal for several nights. The hiss of the radio broke at exactly 3:12 a.m., replaced by a wet, heavy sound that did not belong on the emergency frequency. It was not the snap of static, nor was it the sharp tone of an accidental microphone click. It sounded like something large breathing slowly into a receiver, accompanied by the faint, rhythmic crunch of snow under heavy boots. The transmission lasted for 40 seconds before fading back into the white noise of Channel 6. In the isolated watchtower of Station 4, perched high above a vast, frozen expanse of Montana wilderness, the duty ranger simply sat in the dark and listened. The wilderness in late November was a place of absolute isolation. The tourist season had ended months ago, and the deep valleys were already buried under several feet of early winter snow. Only a skeletal crew remained to monitor the high ridges connected to the outside world by a daisy chain of radio repeaters bolted to the freezing peaks. The nearest paved road was 45 miles away. If something went wrong, help was at least a day's journey by snowmobile. The ranger on duty noted the strange transmission in the nightly logbook, marking it down as a phantom signal caused by atmospheric bouncing, a common enough occurrence in the high mountains. But the following night, at exactly 3:12 a.m., the radio cracked open again. The static dropped away instantly, leaving a dead, empty channel. Then the breathing returned. It was louder this time, closer to the microphone, wet and ragged, dragging in the cold air with a slow, deliberate rhythm. Behind the breathing, there was the same steady crunching sound. something walking through deep snow. The ranger reached for the handset, his thumb hovering over the transmission button, but training held him back. You did not speak into a blind emergency channel unless someone requested aid. He listened as the footsteps seemed to grow louder, as if whoever held the radio was marching steadily toward the microphone itself. By the third night, a deep unease had settled heavily into the watchtower. The ranger had contacted Station 9, located across the valley on the southern ridge, to ask if they had been logging the midnight interference. The operator at Station 9 confirmed the reports. They had heard it too. According to their directional logs, the signal was not bouncing off the upper atmosphere. It was originating from deep within the Blackwood Basin, a densely forested ravine that had been completely inaccessible since the first major blizzard in October. There were no hiking trails down there, no logging roads, and certainly no power sources for a radio transmitter. Yet, the signal was strong, cutting through the high ridge winds with absolute clarity. The Rangers decided to triangulate the broadcast if it happened again. At 3:10 a.m., both men sat by their respective consoles, the green glow of the dials illuminating their small, frost-covered windows. At precisely 3:12 a.m., the squelch broke. The ragged, wet breathing filled both cabins simultaneously. But this time, the footsteps stopped. The deep, agonizing breaths continued for 10 seconds, and then a voice spoke. It was not a human voice. It sounded like a tape recorder playing backwards, a strange metallic distortion that tried to mimic the cadence of human speech without forming actual words. It was a chaotic string of vowels strung together in a hollow, mocking tone. The ranger at Station 4 keyed his microphone. He broke protocol, stating that this was an official channel and instructing the broadcaster to identify themselves. The strange voice stopped immediately. The breathing returned for a few seconds, followed by the heavy click of the transmission ending. The radio went back to hissing static. Across the valley, the operator at Station 9 came over the internal frequency, his voice tight with tension. He had locked onto the origin point of the signal. It was indeed coming from the bottom of the Blackwood Basin, but there was a glaring problem. The signal had originated from an area where the timber was so thick, even a tracked vehicle could not pass through. The next morning, the ranger at Station 4 began digging through the archival logbooks stored in the metal cabinets beneath the main desk. He was looking for any history of strange radio bounce in the basin, any old repeater stations that might have been abandoned and somehow powered back on. He pulled a dusty binder from 1994. As he turned the brittle pages, his finger stopped on a handwritten entry dated November 12, 1994. The duty officer at the time had logged an unknown transmission at 3:12 a.m. The notes described heavy breathing, the sound of footsteps in snow, and a voice that sounded broken and artificial. According to the old log, the 1994 transmissions had continued for 6 consecutive nights. On the 7th night, the duty ranger had requested a search and rescue flyover of the Blackwood Basin, convinced someone was lost and slowly freezing to death while clutching an open radio. The flyover was conducted the following afternoon. The helicopters found nothing but unbroken snow. No tracks, no camps, no signs of life. But the ranger who had written the log never returned for his next shift. The record stated he had resigned abruptly, leaving his gear in the tower and hiking down the mountain alone. The sun set early that evening, casting long, bruised shadows across the snowfields. The wind picked up, rattling the thick glass of the watchtower windows. The ranger at Station 4 made sure the heavy deadbolt on the reinforced wooden door was thrown entirely shut. He stoked the small wood stove, trying to push the damp cold out of the small room, but a strange chill seemed to radiate from the radio console itself. He sat in the low light, watching the digital clock slowly cycle toward 3 a.m. Across the valley, Station 9 was completely silent. The radio check-in at midnight had been brief, both men too on edge to make small talk. 3:12 a.m. arrived. The radio remained silent. The ranger let out a slow breath, thinking perhaps the atmospheric conditions had finally shifted, burying whatever ghost signal was haunting the valley. Then, at 3:14 a.m., the radio clicked. It did not hiss. It simply opened into dead, silent air. There was no breathing this time. No footsteps crunching in the deep snow. There was only the faint, echoing sound of wind blowing through pine trees, captured by a microphone somewhere out in the dark. Then the voice spoke, but it was not the distorted, chaotic string of vowels from the night before. It was a voice the ranger recognized instantly. It was his own. The radio played back his exact transmission from the previous night, down to the slight hesitation and the static pop of the button. The recording played back into the quiet room. This is an official channel. Identify yourself. The playback sounded hollow, stripped of all warmth, as if it were echoing out of a deep canyon. The ranger stared at the speaker, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had not recorded that transmission. There was no tape deck in the tower. The playback ended, and the open air returned. Then his voice played again. This is an official channel. Identify yourself. Only this time, the words were stretched, the pitch dropping lower and lower until it sounded like a heavy, mechanical groan. The words twisted into a slow, rhythmic distortion that mimicked the wet breathing from the first night. Whatever was down in the valley had not just been making noise, it had been learning. The internal frequency buzzed. It was Station 9. The operator's voice was barely a whisper. He told the ranger at Station 4 to look at the triangulation data. The ranger glanced at the secondary monitor. The blinking green dot, representing the origin of the unknown signal, was no longer resting at the bottom of the Blackwood Basin. It was moving. It was ascending the steep western ridge. It was moving straight up the incline through the dense, impassable timber, heading directly towards Station 4. The ranger watched the screen in silent horror. The dot was moving at an impossible speed. No human could climb a 40-degree incline through waist-deep snow in the dark. A snowmobile would have been loud enough to hear across the valley, and it could not navigate the tightly packed pines. Yet the signal marched steadily upward, covering hundreds of feet every minute. The open radio channel continued to broadcast the sound of the wind, but now the heavy, wet breathing had returned. It was louder, faster, matching the pace of something climbing relentlessly toward the summit. The wind outside the tower suddenly died down, leaving an oppressive, suffocating silence around the glass cabin. The only sound in the world was the dreadful, rhythmic breathing pouring from the radio speaker. The ranger backed away from the console, moving toward the center of the room. He realized that the breathing on the radio was no longer accompanied by the sound of crunching snow. The footsteps had stopped. The transmission was perfectly clear now, entirely free of static. The green dot on the monitor blinked one last time, resting precisely on the coordinates of Station 4, before the screen went completely black. The radio channel remained open. The breathing was so loud it rattled the small plastic casing of the speaker. It sounded wet and hungry, echoing in the confined space of the watchtower. The ranger stood frozen, staring at the reinforced door. Slowly, over the sound of the broadcast, he heard a physical noise outside the cabin. It was the heavy, distinct squeak of weight pressing down on the wooden planks of the exterior catwalk. Something had just stepped onto the deck that wrapped around the tower. The breathing on the radio stopped. At the exact same moment, something pressed itself against the heavy glass of the north-facing window. The ranger turned his head slowly. The security lights outside had burned out hours ago, leaving the deck in absolute darkness. But in the faint green glow of the radio dials, he could see a shape blocking the stars. It was tall, too tall to be a man, its silhouette hunched over the glass. A thick, pale mist began to form on the outside of the window pane, condensing as whatever stood there exhaled slowly against the freezing glass. The radio squelch snapped violently, emitting a high-pitched screech of feedback that forced the ranger to cover his ears. The sound was deafening, a localized blast of interference that shattered the quiet of the room. He squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for the glass to break, waiting for the door to splinter inward. The feedback wailed for 10 agonizing seconds before abruptly cutting out. The radio clicked off. The power to the console died. The watchtower was plunged into absolute pitch-black silence. When the morning sun finally broke over the eastern ridge, casting a brilliant, blinding light across the snowfields, the relief crew from the lowlands tried to raise Station 4 for the daily check-in. There was no response. After 2 hours of silence, a tracked vehicle was dispatched up the logging road to investigate. They found the watchtower securely locked from the inside. The wood stove was completely cold. The radio console had been entirely dismantled, its wires ripped from the wall and scattered across the floor in a chaotic tangle. The ranger was gone. There were no signs of a struggle, and more unsettlingly, there were no tracks leading away from the catwalk into the fresh snow. It was as if he had simply vanished into the freezing air. The official incident report blamed a catastrophic electrical failure and severe isolation psychosis, citing the dismantled radio as proof of a mental breakdown. But the logbooks from that week were never entered into the public record. And according to the locals who live near the edge of the park boundaries, if you tune a shortwave radio to the emergency frequency in the dead of winter, somewhere around 3 a.m., you can still hear it. The sound of wet breathing, heavy footsteps in the snow, and a voice trying to remember how to speak. In the Nahanni Valley, locals still avoid one section of the river. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police Patrol found the camp at twilight, nestled in a deep, shadowed bend of the South Nahanni River. It was the autumn of 1908. The fire ring had been cold for weeks, the ashes washed flat by heavy rains, supplies were stacked neatly beside a thick canvas tent, sacks of flour and dried beans sat entirely untouched, while expensive gold prospecting equipment was laid out methodically in the damp moss. But what caused the officers to draw their rifles and step back into the shadows was not the abandoned gear, it was the shape lying just beyond the tree line. Wrapped in heavy winter furs, the body of a man was strapped tightly to a wooden sled. His hands were securely bound, and his head was entirely missing. This discovery would become the first official record of a mystery that would stain the remote Canadian wilderness for over a century. The Nahanni River carves a violent path through the Northwest Territories, surrounded by limestone walls that rise thousands of feet into the sky. It is a place of staggering beauty and extreme hostility. Deep within the canyons, geothermal hot springs heat the frozen earth, creating bizarre tropical microclimates where rare plants bloom in the dead of winter. Thick, sulfurous white fog constantly bleeds from these vents, rolling across the forest floor and swallowing the landscape in an impenetrable veil. To the indigenous Dene people who have lived on the borders of this wilderness for thousands of years, the valley was not a place of refuge. It was a place to be avoided at all costs. The body found tied to the sled belonged to one of the McLeod brothers, Willie and Frank, two prospectors who had ventured into the canyon 3 years earlier in search of a legendary lost gold mine. According to reports, the brothers had ignored the warnings of local guides who spoke of an evil presence dwelling deep within the mist. When the search party eventually located the second brother a short distance from the camp, his remains mirrored the first. His head was also gone. Police reports from the time noted that the camp showed no signs of a struggle. There were no scattered belongings, no torn canvas, and no defensive wounds on the bodies. It was as if whatever had come for them had done so with calm, methodical precision. Investigators initially blamed the grim condition of the bodies on scavenging animals, suggesting that bears or wolves had carried off the skulls. But seasoned trappers in the region pointed out the terrifying inconsistencies in this theory. Animals do not bind a man's hands. They do not strap a body to a sled. And scavengers do not selectively remove a human head while leaving the rest of the body, along with the camp's entire food supply, completely untouched. A deep unease settled over the local trading posts. The area quickly earned a dark nickname among prospectors and trappers, a name it still holds today. They called it the Valley of the Headless Men. For nearly a decade, the canyons remained largely empty. The harsh winters and the lingering fear kept most outsiders away, but the lure of untouched gold is a powerful force. In 1917, a rugged Swiss prospector named Martin Jorgensen decided to test his luck in the valley. He was an experienced woodsman, well-equipped to handle the brutal subarctic conditions. For months, he seemed to thrive. He built a sturdy log cabin near the riverbank, occasionally sending word back to civilization that he had struck a rich vein of gold. He wrote that he had found his fortune and that he planned to stay in the valley until the following spring. But spring came and Jorgensen never emerged from the canyon. A group of travelers passing through the area noticed a column of dark smoke rising from the deep woods. When they investigated, they found Jorgensen's cabin burned to its stone foundations. The heavy logs had been reduced to smoldering embers. Among the ashes, they discovered his skeleton. His rifle was found a few feet away, fully loaded and unfired. And just like the McLeod brothers before him, Jorgensen's skull was nowhere to be found. The gold he had claimed to discover was missing entirely. The silence that surrounded the burned cabin offered no clues. There were no tracks leading away from the ruins, only the quiet rush of the Nahanni River echoing off the canyon walls. The pattern was too specific to ignore. Rumors began to spread wildly through the northern territories. Some believed that a hostile, uncontacted tribe lived deep in the mountains, violently protecting the valley's gold. Others whispered about the Naha, a mythical, fierce tribe from local folklore that was said to dwell in the high peaks, descending only to slaughter those who trespassed. But the indigenous guides insisted the Naha had vanished without a trace centuries ago. The elders warned that the threat in the valley was not a tribe of men. They spoke of evil spirits, of massive creatures that walked upright in the fog, and of an ancient sickness that infected the very soil of the canyon. Despite the grim history, the valley claimed another victim in 1945. An Ontario miner named Ernest Savard was found dead near his camp in the same region. His body was discovered inside his heavy sleeping bag, zipped up tightly against the freezing night air. He had not been burned, nor had he been bound, but the result was the same. His head had been cleanly removed, and it was missing from the campsite. The police investigation concluded with no suspects and no explanation. The sheer isolation of the area made it impossible to secure a crime scene or track down leads. Whoever or whatever was responsible for the mutilations had thousands of square miles of dense, unforgiving wilderness to hide in. By the late 1960s, the era of the lone gold prospector had largely ended, replaced by organized expeditions and recreational adventurers. A group of 4 experienced outdoorsmen traveled to the valley, determined to navigate the treacherous rapids of the Nahanni River. They were well aware of the legends, viewing them as campfire ghost stories meant to scare away tourists. They set up camp on a wide gravel riverbank, surrounded by towering spruce trees and the ever-present sulfur mist from the nearby hot springs. The evening was uneventful. They cooked their food, secured their supplies in bear-proof containers, and retired to their individual tents as the temperature plummeted. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, one of the men awoke to a strange sensation. He later described it to authorities as a feeling of immense atmospheric pressure, a sudden heaviness in the air that made it difficult to breathe. The ambient noise of the wilderness had completely vanished. The wind had stopped howling through the canyon. Even the rushing sound of the river seemed muffled, as if wrapped in thick cotton. He lay awake in his sleeping bag, listening intently to the unnatural silence. Then he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. It was a heavy, wet, dragging noise, moving slowly over the smooth river stones just outside his tent. It sounded like a massive wet sack being pulled across the gravel. The dragging was accompanied by a low, rhythmic thud like the footsteps of something unbelievably heavy. The man held his breath, clutching his hunting knife, too paralyzed by fear to unzip his tent. The dragging sound stopped right beside the thin nylon wall of his shelter. He could hear a deep, ragged exhalation, a breathing so loud and guttural it vibrated in his chest. A foul stench leaked into the tent, smelling of rotten meat and stagnant swamp water. The creature, or person, stood there in the absolute dark for what felt like an eternity. Then, the heavy footsteps slowly moved away, retreating toward the edge of the forest. The man did not sleep the rest of the night. He lay frozen, waiting for the sun to rise. When dawn finally broke, casting a pale gray light through the mist, he emerged from his tent. The camp looked completely normal. The bear-proof containers were untouched, the fire pit was undisturbed. But when he looked toward the tent of his friend, who had been sleeping closest to the tree line, he noticed the flap was hanging wide open. He walked over and looked inside. His friend was gone. His heavy hiking boots were still sitting neatly by the entrance, his winter coat was draped over his backpack, but his sleeping bag and the man inside it had vanished. The remaining 3 men desperately searched the perimeter of the camp. Near the edge of the dense spruce trees, they found a wide path of crushed vegetation, as if something incredibly heavy had been dragged directly into the forest. They followed the trail for nearly a mile, shouting their friend's name into the thick, sulphurous fog. They received no answer. The tracks eventually disappeared at the edge of a sheer cliff face, dropping hundreds of feet into a jagged ravine. Hanging from a branch near the edge, nearly 10 feet off the ground, they found a torn, bloody piece of a nylon sleeping bag. A massive search operation was launched in the following days. Search and rescue teams scoured the canyon, utilizing helicopters and tracker dogs. The dogs were brought to the edge of the woods where the sleeping bag was found, but according to the handlers, the animals panicked. They whined, tucked their tails, and absolutely refused to enter the tree line. The search lasted for 2 weeks, but not a single trace of the missing camper was ever found. He was eventually declared dead, another tragic victim of the unforgiving Nahanni wilderness. The official report cited an animal attack, likely a massive grizzly bear, though no bear tracks were ever identified near the camp. Over the years, strange reports have continued to leak out of the valley. Pilots flying small float planes low over the canyons have reported experiencing sudden, inexplicable compass failures and electrical malfunctions. Some have sworn they saw massive, dark silhouettes standing entirely still in the fog, figures that looked vaguely human but were far too large. Hikers who stray too close to the hot springs often report the sudden, overpowering stench of rotting meat, followed by the distinct sound of heavy, bipedal footsteps shadowing them from just out of sight. The feeling of being hunted is so intense that many turn back before completing their journey. Today, the Nahanni National Park Reserve is a protected area. Visitors are strictly regulated, and deep ventures into the canyons require specialized permits. Park rangers warn every group to stick together, to keep their campsites clean, and to never wander away from the firelight alone. But despite modern equipment, satellite phones, and global positioning systems, the valley remains an isolated, silent world of its own. The steep limestone walls block communication signals, and the sudden, violent weather changes can ground rescue helicopters for days. If you find yourself in trouble out there, you are entirely on your own. Some investigators still believe there is a rational explanation for the history of severed heads and vanished campers. They point to the extreme psychological toll of total isolation, suggesting that cabin fever or mercury poisoning from mining operations drove men to murder each other in gruesome ways. They argue that scavengers simply finished the job, carrying away the skulls. But these logical theories provide little comfort to those who have actually stood in the deep shadows of the canyon, listening to the wind howl through the rocks, watching the thick white fog pour out of the earth. The mystery of the valley remains a dark, open wound in the history of the Canadian North. The remains of Willie and Frank McLeod, Martin Jorgensen, and Ernest Savard were eventually buried, their case files gathering dust in forgotten archives. The gold they were searching for was never recovered. The indigenous locals continue to pass down the ancient warnings, refusing to camp near the haunted sections of the river. They know that the sheer, towering walls of the canyon keep secrets hidden perfectly in the dark. There is a stretch of the South Nahanni River where the water grows strangely calm, and the sulfur mist hangs so thick you cannot see the opposite bank. The silence there is heavy, almost suffocating, broken only by the occasional sound of rocks tumbling down the distant cliffs. If you stand by the water's edge at twilight, When the shadows stretch long across the gravel, you might hear a low, wet, dragging sound coming from the trees. According to those who know the legends, it is best not to turn your flashlight toward the noise. Whatever took the heads of the prospectors over a century ago never left the valley. It is still out there, hiding in the fog, waiting patiently for the fire to burn out. Every night at 3:17, someone knocked in Cedar Rapids. The first knock came while the house was already awake. It was not loud. That was what the woman remembered later, when she tried to explain why she had not called anyone the first night or the second. It was too measured for panic, too polite for danger. 3 slow strikes against the front door, each one spaced evenly, as if a visitor stood on the porch with one gloved hand raised in the dark, certain that sooner or later someone inside would answer. When she looked at the clock on the stove, the green numbers had just changed to 3:17 a.m. By the time she reached the little pane of glass beside the door, the porch was empty. The street beyond it was empty too. The houses along the block were dark, their windows black and shut, their yards silvered faintly by a weak street lamp at the corner. There had been no footsteps on the steps, no car engine, no shape moving away across the lawn. Only the cold white reflection of her own face in the glass, and the sense that whoever had knocked had done it with complete confidence, as though the silence afterward mattered more than the sound itself. The next night, it happened again. 3 knocks, the same careful rhythm, the same time. Her husband sat up in bed before the third one landed. He had heard it too. This time, he went to the door immediately, flicking on the porch light as he moved, opening it fast enough to catch anyone who might have been hiding close to the frame. But the porch was bare. The steps were bare, the sidewalk was bare. A little wind moved through the dry leaves gathered under the hedge, and somewhere farther down the street, a dog began barking in a nervous, strangled way, then cut itself off all at once. In the morning, they found nothing on the porch. No prank, no sign of forced entry, no footprints in the damp strip of dirt near the flower bed. The husband walked the perimeter of the house, checking the windows, the alley, the detached garage. Everything was shut, everything was still. After 4 nights, the woman mentioned it to a neighbor, expecting embarrassment on her own face as she spoke. Instead, she saw recognition. The neighbor did not answer right away. He stood with one hand on his trash bin, looking past her toward the row of houses, as if choosing whether to say what he knew. Then he asked what time it happened. When she told him, he let go of the bin slowly. According to later accounts, that was the first time anyone on the block understood the complaints were not separate. One family on the next street had heard knocking at 3:17 a.m. for nearly 2 weeks and had assumed it was teenagers. An older man living alone had reported the same thing a month earlier, though by then the police had found no one on his property and no damage to the house. A renter 3 blocks away claimed the knocks had started after the house next door was vacated and continued even after the power was shut off inside it. None of the reports sounded serious by daylight. They became serious only when spoken together. Soon, people were waking before the sound came. Some sat in darkened living rooms and stared at their front doors from across the room, waiting for the hour to turn. Some watched from upstairs windows where they could see the porch and the sidewalk at once. One man on the corner kept his truck idling in the driveway, headlights pointed straight at the front steps. Another left a floodlight burning all night over the front walk, but the pattern did not change. At 3:17 a.m., there would come that same restrained knocking from the front entrance. Never frantic, never hurried, never repeated after the first set. Whoever heard it and rushed outside found nothing. The strangest report came from a woman who had moved out for a week to stay with her sister. She had not wanted to sleep in the house anymore. Her youngest son had begun waking before the knocks, sitting up in bed and whispering that someone was standing on the porch without a face. The boy was too young, in her view, to understand how to frighten adults properly, and that made it worse. So she packed clothes, took the children, and left the place empty. Her husband stayed elsewhere as well. No one remained inside the house. A neighbor across the street told police that the knocking still came. Night after night, at the same time, 3 measured strikes on the front door of a house that no longer held anyone at all. It should have ended there, in that category of quiet local disturbances that never become anything larger. A prankster could not be caught. A prowler could not be identified. There were no injuries, no broken locks, no theft, no body lying in a yard, only sound, only repetition. The kind of thing that turns into rumor because rumor is easier to hold than an unanswered fact. But then people began noticing details that did not belong together. One resident later said, the knocks never sounded like knuckles on wood. He had assumed they did, because what else could they be? Yet once he sat close enough to the entryway to hear them from inside the front room, he thought the sound was wrong. Too hollow, perhaps, or too flat, as if whatever struck the door had no give to it. Another said the sound seemed to come from shoulder height, then chest height, then lower, though always on the same door. A retired carpenter on the block told neighbors that the front panel on his door carried the vibrations strangely, almost as if the impact landed on the outside and the inside at once. Several people began leaving powder on their porches. Flour, mostly, sometimes ash from fireplaces. One man spread a clean layer of dust from the edge of the welcome mat all the way to the top step, hoping to catch shoe prints. In the morning, the powder remained smooth, untouched, except for the thin score where the door had swung open after the knocks and the family had rushed out again. No footprints approached. No footprints left. According to local retellings, one household set a chair directly against the inside of the front door and waited with the father seated in it, hand pressed to the wood. The knocks came on schedule. He leaped back afterward and told his wife, with a face that had gone pale in a way she had never seen before, that he had heard the sound clearly but felt nothing touch the door at all. Autumn came in slowly, flattening the lawns and turning the trees brittle around the edges. The neighborhood learned the hour by instinct. Lamps burned later than they used to. Window curtains remained cracked just enough for one suspicious eye. In daylight, people laughed at themselves because daylight demanded it. They discussed raccoons, pipes, branches, settling wood, bored teenagers, some trick of distance that made a sound from elsewhere land on a front porch. Yet every explanation broke on the same fact. The knocking happened at 3:17 a.m., in the same rhythm, under too many different conditions, whether the houses were occupied or empty, lit or dark, watched or unwatched. One of the houses had been empty long enough to begin looking blind. The grass had gone coarse around the foundation. Circular marks from flower pots remained on the porch where nothing sat anymore. The front window had a paper notice folded against the glass from the inside, pale and unreadable from the street. Local residents later disagreed over whether that house had ever received the knocks before it was vacated or only after. But more than one person claimed that if they stood outside at the right angle after midnight, they could see movement behind the front curtains even though the power was off and the place had been cleared. A patrol car was sent more than once. Officers found quiet streets, locked doors, tired homeowners standing barefoot on front walks in robes and coats, each one embarrassed to be there. Official responses, insofar as anyone remembered them, were practical and brief. There was no suspect, no evidence of attempted entry, no sign anyone had been on the property. Disturbance complaints were taken, noted, and folded into the ordinary paper drift of city life. But one story remained, repeated years afterward in lowered voices, because it attached itself to a uniform and therefore sounded more solid than the rest. The story said that one officer arrived just before the hour and parked with his headlights off halfway down the block. He waited in the car where he could see two front porches at once. At 3:17 a.m., he heard the knocks. He was certain of that. 3 even blows. He also saw, or believed he saw, that neither porch light changed, no door opened, no person stood on either set of steps. The sound seemed to arrive without a source. He drove up at once, checked the yards, and found the street completely empty. Years later, depending on who told it, the officer either requested no more overnight calls to that block or laughed the matter off and refused to discuss it. Stories like that tend to harden where facts are thin. The woman from the first house began sleeping in the back room. It changed nothing. The knocking still reached her, muted by distance but exact in its timing. One night, after weeks of poor sleep, she made a decision that embarrassed her even in the moment. She moved quietly through the dark house, unlocked the front door, and opened it a few inches before the hour, leaving the chain latched so the porch showed only as a slim column of night. She wanted to prove something to herself. If there was a prankster, the open crack would reveal movement. If there was someone standing close to the frame, they might speak. If it was all imagination, then the empty porch might settle the matter once and for all. The house stood in silence around her. A refrigerator motor clicked on and off. Somewhere, a board shifted faintly in the hallway. From outside came nothing at all. Then, at 3:17 a.m., the door moved under the chain. Not inward by much, not enough to throw metal hard against metal. Just a careful pressure from the other side, as if someone had placed a hand against the edge and discovered, with mild surprise, that it was already open. The woman later said she heard no knock that night, only that pressure. Only the slow testing of the door, followed by stillness so complete she could hear her own pulse in her ears. She slammed it shut and woke her husband in tears he had no way to comfort. After that, other sounds entered the reports. A faint tread on front steps after the knocks, though no one was seen. A whisper outside the storm door that could not be made out. The scrape of something along the porch railing. One family found their wind chime hanging perfectly still after the sound, even though the trees overhead were moving in a steady breeze. Another found the brass knocker on their door warm to the touch, though they swore no one had used it. The most unsettling detail did not come from the porches at all, it came from inside. More than one witness later claimed that on nights when the knocking was heard, a second sound followed several moments later from deeper in the house. Not always. Not in every house, but enough times to survive in retelling. A floorboard shifting in an empty upstairs room, a closet door easing against its frame, the soft impact of something settling in a hallway where no one stood. It was as though the sound at the front door was not asking to be let in, but announcing that something had already crossed the threshold by another route. By early winter, the block had changed its habits. People visited less after dark. Children were called indoors before evening fully set. The ordinary courtesy of neighborhood life thinned into tired nods and half-finished conversations in driveways. A few residents began keeping radios on through the night, low and steady, just to disturb the silence before the hour arrived. It did not help. The knocking came through radio static as easily as through stillness. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, it stopped. For several nights, there was nothing. Then a week. Then 2. People did not trust the absence at first. They waited awake, then drowsing, then sleeping again. Porch lights went dark earlier, curtains were left open, the neighborhood loosened. Some said the cold had driven away whoever had been responsible. Some said the police had frightened off a prankster at last. Others did not offer theories. They only enjoyed the relief. The empty house remained empty through that stretch of quiet. Snow gathered shallowly along the walk and froze there in gray ridges. Circular drifts formed around the porch posts. The paper in the front window had yellowed more at the edges. One evening, a real estate worker came by to inspect the property before a sale and left after less than 20 minutes, though the weather was clear and there was still light enough to work. No reason was given. The lockbox stayed on the rail for a while after that, bumping lightly in the wind. When the new occupants finally arrived, neighbors watched from behind their curtains. A man and a woman, not old, with a rented truck and the tired, brittle cheerfulness of people trying to turn a strange house into a chosen one. They brought in boxes, lamps, kitchen chairs, a rolled rug, a mattress. The porch light burned warm above them. Several nearby residents considered crossing the street to say something. None of them did. Warning someone about a rumor requires believing it enough to sound foolish in another person's face. The first night passed without incident. The second night passed too. On the third morning, the woman from the original house woke before dawn to a sound she had hoped never to hear again. 3 slow knocks. Exact. Measured. Unmistakable. She sat upright in bed, unable to breathe for a moment because the sound had not come from her own door this time. It had come from across the street, from the house that had stood empty through all those weeks of silence. According to what neighbors later pieced together, the new occupants had heard the knocking at 3:17 a.m. and assumed someone needed help. The man went downstairs while his wife stayed in the hall above. He opened the door. She heard him say nothing, or perhaps only a single word spoken too softly to carry. Then she heard the storm door close again. When she came down to the entryway, he was gone. His boots were still on the mat. His coat still hung over the banister. The front door was shut, but not locked. There were no footprints leading away from the porch, except the marks left later by police and neighbors searching the yard. No one on the block reported seeing a person crossing the street, entering a car, or moving through the alley. The man was simply no longer in the house. Searches were made. Questions were asked. The story spread beyond the neighborhood then, because a disappearance has weight that a sound does not. Yet, even in that larger telling, certainty remained difficult. Some said the man had a reason to leave and chose the hour for his own purposes. Some insisted there must have been evidence not shared publicly. Some rejected the link entirely, claiming frightened neighbors had sewn two unrelated events together into a legend. It is possible they were right. But local memory kept the order of things intact. The months of disturbance complaints, the empty porches, the watched houses, the exact time, the knocks continuing even when no one was home. And at the center of it, the feeling shared by those who heard them that the sound was never random, never testing, never confused. It was the sound of arrival. Years later, people on that side of Cedar Rapids still avoided certain kinds of silence. A few of the old houses were renovated, some were sold, families came and went, children grew up and left the block, carrying only fragments of the story with them. New owners often knew nothing about the complaints unless someone chose to tell them. Even then, the details changed from mouth to mouth. 3 knocks became 4, then returned to 3. The season shifted depending on the teller. The empty house moved 1 street over. That is the ordinary erosion of memory. Yet one detail survived with unusual strength, not because it could be proven, but because too many people repeated it exactly. Now and then, in the last dark stretch before dawn, a resident would wake for no clear reason and look at the clock, 3:17 a.m. Then would come that old, helpless stillness, the sense of a whole neighborhood holding its breath. On rare nights, someone still claimed to hear the knocks, not always on their own door, sometimes faint and far off, as if heard through several houses at once. 3 patient blows, then nothing. No one ever agreed on what would happen if a person opened the door quickly enough, or left it open before the sound arrived, or chose not to move at all. Theories survive because they are never tested in the one way that matters. The woman who first heard the knocking kept living in Cedar Rapids for years, but she never again stood waiting at the entryway before the hour. She slept with a lamp on in the back room and kept a chair beneath the knob until she moved away. The house where the man vanished changed hands more than once. In photographs taken during later listings, the front porch looks ordinary. 2 posts, narrow steps. A plain door with a small pane beside it that reflects the street. There is nothing in those images to suggest the place ever held more than routine unhappiness, more than the usual weathering of Midwestern winters and summers. Still, people who know the story tend to notice the same thing when they look too long. The porch appears as if someone has just stepped out of frame. And if the picture is viewed late enough at night, when the room behind the viewer has gone quiet and the glass begins to give back a faint reflection of the watcher's own face, there is sometimes the brief, absurd impression that another shape is standing closer to the door than it should be, waiting with one hand raised, patient as ever, for the minute to come around again. A Banff trail case where time did not match the distance. When search and rescue volunteers finally located David near the lower bend of the Banff Ridge Trail, the immediate confusion was not that he was injured, but that he was entirely unrecognizable. He had been missing for exactly 48 hours. Yet, as the lead tracker approached the slumped figure resting against a decaying cedar tree, he noted that the man possessed a thick, untrimmed beard and fingernails that had grown long, yellowed, and brittle. His hiking boots, purchased brand new just 3 days prior, according to his wife, were worn down to the smooth, treadless rubber. The leather of the boots was cracked and bleached by an impossible amount of sun. He sat only 2 miles from the main parking lot, staring vacantly into the dense, damp ferns. The incident occurred in October of 1998 in a remote, fog-heavy stretch of the Cascade Mountains. David was 34 years old, an experienced outdoorsman who closely followed local elevation shifts and weather patterns. He had planned a simple 6-mile loop up the ridge and back down through the valley. It was a Saturday. He left a detailed itinerary on his kitchen counter, stating he would be home by 6 o'clock in the evening. When darkness fell and his vehicle remained the only one left in the gravel lot at the trailhead, the local Forest Service was notified. By Sunday morning, a standard grid search had commenced. The weather was unusually mild for late autumn. There was no rain, no sudden drop in temperature, and no wind to disturb the forest floor. Search dogs were brought in to trace his scent from the driver's side door of his car to the wooden trailhead marker. They followed the invisible path easily for the first mile, their noses pressed to the damp earth. But near an area locals called the Silent Basin, a natural depression surrounded by towering, moss-draped Douglas firs, the dogs stopped. They did not bark, and they did not whine. They simply sat down on the trail, refusing to cross an invisible threshold, their focus locked on the empty woods ahead. The human searchers pressed on, leaving the animals behind and moving through the basin in a sweeping line. The silence in that specific section of the forest was profound. Several volunteers later reported a strange heavy pressure in their ears, similar to the sensation of descending rapidly in an airplane. The natural sounds of the woods, the rustling of leaves, the calls of distant birds, and the rushing of nearby creeks simply ceased to exist. It was in this pocket of dead air that they found the first strange piece of evidence. It was a single boot print pressed deep into a patch of soft mud. The tread pattern matched the new boots David had been wearing. However, the stride length was entirely wrong. The distance between the right footprint and the next left footprint was nearly 9 feet. It was a distance impossible for a man to cover in a single walking step, suggesting he had been running at a dead sprint or perhaps leaping in blind terror. More disturbing to the trackers was the direction. The footprints did not lead deeper into the woods, nor did they lead back toward the trail. They turned abruptly and led straight into a dense wall of thorny underbrush where no path existed. Following the projected path of those leaping strides, a volunteer found a discarded plastic water bottle resting upright on a flat stone. It belonged to David. It was completely empty, bone dry on the inside, without a single drop of condensation. The clear plastic had yellowed significantly and turned brittle to the touch, exactly as if it had been sitting in the relentless heat of a desert sun for several years. When the volunteer picked it up, the plastic cracked audibly beneath the light pressure of his fingers. The search was suspended at nightfall and resumed early Monday morning. The atmosphere on the mountain had shifted overnight. A thick, clinging mist rolled through the pine trees, limiting visibility to less than 50 feet. At approximately 9:15 a.m., a Forest Service dispatcher monitoring the emergency radio channels caught a brief, heavily distorted transmission. It was not broadcast on the standard civilian band, nor was it intercepted on a ham radio frequency. It came through on a secured tactical channel used exclusively by park rangers and emergency personnel. The voice breaking through the heavy static was weak, parched, and trembling. It was later positively identified as David by his wife, though the tone was undeniably altered. He did not ask for help. He did not provide his coordinates or describe his injuries. Instead, the dispatcher listened as the man muttered in a low, exhausted, almost hypnotic monotone. He stated clearly that the sun had not come up. He repeated this exact phrase 3 times. He then whispered that he had been walking down the same slope for weeks, but the trees were only getting taller and the path beneath his feet was turning to gray ash. The transmission ended abruptly with a sharp, mechanical click. Tracking the signal proved impossible. The radio tower logs showed no origin point for the broadcast, no triangulation data, and no registered radio ID. It was as if the audio had simply manifested directly out of the speakers in the dispatch room. Meanwhile, The ground teams were circling back toward the lower bend of the trail, sweeping an area they had already thoroughly checked the day before. The mist was particularly thick near the base of the ridge. It was here, just 20 yards off the marked path, that a volunteer noticed a dark shape huddled against the massive roots of a dead tree. David did not react when his name was called. His eyes were open, but he did not blink. The pupils were dilated to the very edge of his irises, rendering his eyes completely black against the pale whites. The paramedics who arrived on the scene documented an array of physical impossibilities. He was severely malnourished, his collarbones and ribcage visible beneath the torn remnants of his wool sweater. His skin was leathered, deeply tanned, and heavily weathered. The internal zipper of his jacket, made of stainless steel, had rusted completely shut. But the most disturbing detail was the digital watch strapped securely to his left wrist. The glass face of the watch was scratched and clouded with thick condensation. The digital readout was still functioning, powered by a specialized, long-lasting battery. When the lead medic checked the screen to log the official time of recovery, he found that the watch displayed a date in the middle of October in the year 2005. The internal calendar of the device had advanced exactly 7 years over the course of 48 hours. The stopwatch function, which David frequently used to time his hikes, was still running. It showed over 61,000 hours logged. They carried him out of the woods on a rigid backboard. He offered no resistance, his limbs limp and unresponsive. The medics estimated he weighed no more than 110 pounds, a staggering loss from his documented weight of 180. At the local hospital, the attending physicians were baffled by his preliminary blood work. His body showed the advanced stages of prolonged starvation and severe vitamin deficiencies, conditions that typically take many months, if not years, to develop. The soles of his feet provided further grim evidence. When the nurses removed the remnants of his wool socks, they found the skin covered in thick, hardened calluses. The heels were split and bleeding, with layers of dead tissue built up in a manner consistent with someone who had walked barefoot across rough terrain for thousands of miles. Yet, despite these signs of immense physical decay over an agonizingly long period, an examination of his digestive tract revealed the partially digested remains of the oat granola bar he had been seen eating in his car on Saturday morning. Biological time and chronological time had violently separated within his own body. Investigators attempted to piece together the missing 2 days by examining his personal belongings. His day pack, constructed of heavy-duty, weather-resistant nylon, was frayed at every seam. The bright red fabric was bleached almost white, heavily stained with a pale gray dust that did not match the soil composition of the Cascade Mountains. Deep inside the main compartment, wrapped inside a brittle plastic bag, they found his 35mm camera. The film roll was carefully extracted in a darkroom and sent to a specialized laboratory for development. There were 24 exposures on the roll. The first 3 photographs were perfectly normal. They depicted the gravel parking lot, the wooden trailhead marker, and a shot of the morning mist rolling through the lower valley. The lighting was consistent with an overcast Saturday morning. The 4th photograph, however, showed the edge of the silent basin, and the lighting was deeply unnatural. The shadows cast by the dense fir trees fell in conflicting directions, crisscrossing over the trail, suggesting multiple dim light sources in the sky, none of them directly overhead. From the 5th frame onward, the images documented a landscape that no park ranger, surveyor, or local historian could identify. The trees in the photographs were dead and entirely stripped of bark. Their trunks were smooth, twisting upward like blackened, broken fingers against a pale, featureless sky. The ground was covered in a thick layer of the same gray ash found on his backpack. There was no underbrush, no rocks, and no trail markers. Just an endless, repeating expanse of dead timber and gray dust. The photographs grew increasingly erratic as the roll progressed. Frames 15 through 20 were heavily blurred, taken in motion. The camera was pointed downward or angled wildly at the sky, suggesting the photographer was running in absolute panic. The lighting in these middle frames grew progressively darker, the featureless sky fading into a deep, impenetrable black. The final photograph on the roll, the 24th frame, remains the most debated and heavily classified piece of evidence in the entire case file. It was severely underexposed, dominated by absolute darkness. But near the center of the frame, caught in a grainy, out-of-focus blur, was a towering structure. It appeared to be a massive stone staircase carved directly into the side of an impossibly sheer cliff face. Standing on the lower steps of the staircase were tall, vaguely human silhouettes. They were elongated and impossibly thin, their limbs disproportionate to their bodies. Their featureless heads were turned entirely toward the camera lens. The only illumination in the photograph was a dim, sickly red glow radiating from the top of the stairs, casting long, unnatural shadows down the steps. David never regained the ability to speak. He spent his remaining weeks in a secure, private room in a state medical ward. He spent his days sitting rigidly in a chair, staring blankly out the window at the distant tree line of the surrounding hills. He refused to sleep in the dark. He became violently agitated, screaming soundlessly if the nurses attempted to turn off the overhead fluorescent lights. Whenever the room darkened, even momentarily from a passing cloud, he would scramble backward, press his spine against the farthest wall, and cover his eyes with his bruised, trembling hands. His physical deterioration accelerated at a terrifying, unnatural rate. Within a single month, his untrimmed hair and beard turned entirely stark white. His teeth loosened and fell out. His bone density collapsed, leaving him fragile and bedridden. Medical specialists were flown in from out of state, but they could only diagnose his condition as an incredibly aggressive, entirely unprecedented form of rapid cellular aging. He was aging years in a matter of days. He passed away quietly in his sleep on a Tuesday evening in late November, exactly 6 weeks after he was found near the trail. The official death certificate filed by the county coroner listed the primary cause of death as complete heart failure brought on by severe environmental exposure and clinical dehydration. No mention of the advanced cellular decay, the mismatched timeline, or the impossible state of his equipment was included in the public medical record. The investigative case file was quietly closed. The anomalies were officially written off in internal memos as severe delirium combined with manufacturing defects in his gear. His digital watch was placed in a sealed evidence locker in the basement of the regional precinct, its scratched screen still glowing, silently counting the thousands of impossible hours. The camera, the brittle water bottle, and the envelope of developed photographs were archived deep within the state's missing persons database, filed under an obscure case number, rarely requested and never published for the public to see. But among the tight-knit community of search and rescue teams who still work the Banff Ridge Trail, the story of David remains a quiet, persistent warning. The veteran trackers of the unit will never hike through the Silent Basin alone, regardless of the weather. They advise newcomers to always keep a close eye on their own shadows, ensuring they only ever point in one single direction. And if the surrounding forest ever grows completely, entirely silent, if the birds stop calling and the wind dies down to nothing, they are told to turn around immediately and walk back to the parking lot. They are warned to leave before the path beneath their feet begins to stretch, before the trees start to grow unnaturally tall, and before the time required to walk home becomes longer than the years they have left to live. An Appalachian cabin case with no footprints leading in or out. It was 3 o'clock in the morning when Deputy Miller reached the tree line. The snow was knee-deep and completely untouched, pale and luminous under the light of a fractured moon. No tracks led up to the porch. No paths broke the smooth, glittering surface of the drifts. Yet, the heavy oak front door of the cabin was standing wide open, a dark, gaping rectangle against the weathered wood. A single lantern swung gently from the rafters inside, casting long, erratic shadows across the snow-covered threshold. The county dispatcher had received the call exactly 1 hour earlier, a frantic voice whispering that someone was outside the windows. But the fresh powder, undisturbed for at least 12 hours, told a different, impossible story. The cabin sat at the end of an unnamed logging road, a mile and a half from County Route 44, buried deep within the Appalachian spine. It belonged to an older man, a retired archivist who spent his winters in total isolation, seeking the heavy, suffocating silence of the deep woods. For nearly 20 years, the man had never called emergency services. He was known in the nearest town only as a shadow who bought bulk supplies in November and disappeared until the spring thaw. But according to the 911 operator who took the call at 2:15 a.m., the man had been entirely coherent, speaking in a low, terrified hush. He claimed he could hear heavy, wet footsteps circling the exterior walls, pressing against the glass. He said they sounded like someone walking in soaked leather boots. Miller stood at the edge of the clearing, his breath pluming in the freezing air. The temperature was 10 degrees below zero, cold enough to make the moisture in his nose freeze with every inhalation. He aimed his heavy flashlight at the ground, sweeping the blinding beam across the expanse of snow, separating the forest edge from the cabin. Nothing. The snow was a pristine, glittering sheet stretching out for 50 yards in every direction. Not a single indentation, not an animal track, not a displaced branch. If someone had been circling the cabin just 45 minutes ago, they had done it without ever touching the ground. He approached slowly, forcing his way through the deep drifts, creating the only trail in the entire clearing. The silence was absolute, the kind of crushing quiet that makes the ears ring and the heart beat too loud. As he stepped onto the wooden porch, the boards groaned under his heavy winter boots. He drew his service weapon, his fingers stiff and clumsy inside his thick gloves. He called out, his voice swallowed instantly by the dense trees and the falling snow. No answer came from the dark interior. There was only the rhythmic creak of the swinging lantern, its fuel nearly exhausted, the flame sputtering and throwing wild, shifting shadows against the log walls. Miller crossed the threshold, stepping out of the wind and into the gloom. The inside of the cabin was freezing, the iron stove in the corner entirely cold, radiating a deep, metallic chill. But there was a scent in the air that did not belong in the high mountains during winter. It was not the familiar smell of pine, wood smoke, or old paper. It smelled heavily of stagnant water, river mud, and wet, decaying earth. It was a thick, humid odor that clung to the back of the throat. He shined his light across the wooden floorboards, moving past the small kitchen area. There, clearly illuminated in the harsh white beam, was a trail of dark, wet footprints. The prints began abruptly in the center of the room, far from the doors and windows. They were large, the shape of a heavy work boot without treads, caked in thick, dark mud that was already beginning to freeze into rigid ridges on the floor. Miller followed the trail with his flashlight, his breathing growing shallow. The prints did not lead toward the open front door. They did not lead toward the rear window, which was bolted shut from the inside with a heavy iron latch. They walked in a tight, deliberate circle around a faded armchair facing the cold fireplace. The tracks overlapped, pacing over and over in the exact same loop, tracking freezing mud deep into the fibers of a braided wool rug. The armchair was empty. A thick wool blanket lay tangled on the floor beside it, as if someone had stood up in a blind panic, kicking it away. On the small wooden side table, a ceramic cup of coffee sat untouched. Miller stepped closer, careful not to disturb the muddy tracks, and pressed the side of the mug with his bare knuckle. It was still warm. The archivist had been sitting here, drinking coffee in the dead of the night, while something paced around him in tight, muddy circles. And then, the old man was simply gone, leaving no trace of a struggle and no tracks leading away. Miller raised his light, searching the rafters, the dark corners, the narrow loft above the bed. The cabin was a single open room with nowhere to hide. He walked toward the telephone mounted on the far wall near the pantry. The receiver was dangling by its coiled cord, swaying slightly, a faint dial tone hissing like static in the quiet room. Beneath the phone, a small yellow notepad lay open on a slanted wooden desk. A pen had rolled off the edge and lay on the floorboards. The final entry on the notepad was written in hurried, uneven handwriting, pressing so hard into the paper that the pen had nearly torn through the page. It was completely unlike the precise, careful script found in the rest of the notebooks stacked on the desk. The ink was still fresh, smeared at the edges by a trembling hand. It read simply, "They are not outside." The realization settled over Miller like ice water against the spine. The panicked call to the 911 operator had not been a plea for help against an intruder in the snow. It had been a desperate, fatal misinterpretation. The heavy, wet footsteps the man heard through the walls were not echoing from the woods, they were echoing from the floorboards directly behind his chair. Backup arrived 2 hours later, fighting their way up the snow-choked logging road with tire chains and floodlights. They found Miller sitting on the front porch, staring out at the unbroken expanse of snow, his radio turned off. They tore the cabin apart, looking for hidden compartments or cellar doors, but found nothing but solid earth beneath the foundation. They searched the woods for a radius of 5 miles, bringing in tracking dogs at dawn. The dogs refused to approach the cabin, whining and pulling back toward the cruisers. They dragged the frozen creek down in the valley. They found no trace of the archivist, not a single scrap of clothing, not a drop of blood. Furthermore, they found no explanation for the mud inside the cabin, which laboratory testing later revealed was composed of brackish sediment from a coastal swamp basin located over 400 miles away. The case file was eventually boxed away, labeled as an unsolved disappearance, though the details were heavily redacted in the public reports. Local residents rarely speak of the old cabin, and even seasoned hunters refuse to track through that specific section of the woods during the winter months. To this day, the official records maintain the impossible contradiction of that night. The wet mud inside the cabin remained frozen onto the floorboards for weeks. The snow outside remained perfectly undisturbed until the spring thaw melted it away. The archivist never walked out of that front door, but something else walked in, leaving its filth on the floor without ever taking a step across the snow. The unlocked door, the Sacramento vampire. There is a profound fragility to the concept of home. We surround ourselves with walls of plaster and wood, arrange our furniture, and fill the space with the soft light of television screens and the quiet hum of refrigerators. We convince ourselves that the perimeter is secure, but the boundary between the absolute safety of a living room and the vast, unpredictable darkness of the outside world relies almost entirely on a single piece of metal. A deadbolt, a latch, a simple twist of the wrist before bed. In the sleepy, sun-baked suburbs of Sacramento, California, in the winter of 1977, that illusion of safety was shattered forever. The residents of those quiet neighborhoods would soon learn that a door is only a barrier if you remember to lock it. If you forget, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes an invitation. To understand the creeping dread that paralyzed the city during the early weeks of 1978, one must understand the twisted logic of the man walking its streets. Richard Trenton Chase was fundamentally broken, his mind consumed by severe paranoid schizophrenia. He did not live in the same reality as the families settling down for dinner behind their suburban windows. Chase was haunted by somatic delusions of the most horrifying nature. He believed with absolute and terrifying certainty that his heart was shrinking. He believed his own blood was turning into a dry, useless powder. In his decaying mind, the only cure, the only way to keep his own heart beating, was to consume the fresh blood and organs of others. He began with the neighborhood animals, leaving a trail of mutilated pets and gruesome remains in the quiet canyons and empty lots. But as his illness deepened, the animals were no longer enough to satisfy the frantic, paranoid demands of his failing body. The shadow that was Richard Chase began to turn his hollow eyes toward the houses, towards the people living inside them. And as he walked the sidewalks in a filthy, oversized orange ski parka, his pockets heavy with a .22 caliber pistol and a butcher knife, He operated under a very specific, deeply ingrained delusion regarding the rules of entry. To Chase, a locked door was an insurmountable barrier. It was a clear, undeniable statement of rejection. If he walked up to a porch, gripped the brass handle, and found it held fast by a lock, he would simply let go and walk away. He believed that the locked door meant he was not welcome there. But an unlocked door held a completely different meaning. In the fractured, magical thinking of his mind, an unlocked door was not an oversight. It was not a neighbor taking out the trash, or a teenager running to the car, or a tired mother simply forgetting to turn the deadbolt after carrying groceries inside. To Richard Chase, an unlocked door was an open, willful invitation to enter. Imagine the sheer horror of this delusion applied to the mundane reality of everyday life. You are sitting in your favorite chair. The evening news is murmuring on the television. The hallway is bathed in the warm, yellow glow of a reading lamp. You are relaxed, defenseless, wearing your comfortable clothes, entirely enveloped in the sanctuary of your own home. You hear the faint, metallic click of the front doorknob turning. You do not panic. Your mind rationalizes the sound instantly. It must be your husband returning from his shift or your roommate coming back from the store. You do not even turn your head as the heavy wooden door swings open on its hinges. But the footsteps that cross the threshold are too heavy. The breathing is ragged, wet, and frantic. And when you finally look up, it is not a loved one standing in your foyer. It is a hollow-eyed stranger, his clothes stiff with dried, dark stains, casually stepping into your sanctuary with a butcher knife in his hand, looking at you not with malice, but with the cold, calculated entitlement of an invited guest. This nightmare became reality on the 23rd of January, 1978. Teresa Wallen, a 22-year-old woman who was 3 months pregnant, was enjoying a quiet morning in her home. The sun was up, the neighborhood was awake. It was the kind of ordinary morning that promises nothing but routine. Teresa had briefly stepped out to empty the garbage, a chore so mundane it barely registers in the memory. When she stepped back inside, she closed the front door behind her. But she did not lock it. Why would she? It was broad daylight. She was safe in her own home. Moments later, Richard Chase walked up her driveway. He approached the front door. He reached out with pale, trembling fingers and tested the handle. The latch clicked. The door gave way. The invitation was accepted. The details of what occurred inside the Wallen home over the next hour are a descent into profound, unspeakable darkness. Chase did not sneak in. He simply entered. When he encountered Teresa, there was no hesitation. He shot her fatally, and then the true horror of his pathology was unleashed. He utilized the butcher knife he brought with him, acting with the frantic, messy desperation of a starving man at a banquet. He harvested what he believed he needed to survive. He bathed in her blood. He drank from her, using a yogurt cup he found in her own kitchen, turning the mundane objects of her domestic life into tools of his gruesome ritual. When her husband returned home later that afternoon, he did not just find his wife dead, he found his sanctuary violated, transformed into an abattoir, all because the front door had been left unlatched. The terror in Sacramento escalated with blinding speed. Just 4 days later, on the 27th of January, the invitation was extended again. Less than a mile away, another door was left unlocked. This time, it was the home of 38-year-old Evelyn Myroth. Inside the house with her were her friend Dan Meredith, her 6-year-old nephew Jason Sorois, and her 22-month-old nephew Baby David. 4 people going about their day behind a door that someone had forgotten to secure. Chase tested the knob. It turned. The nightmare walked in from the daylight. Dan Meredith was in the hallway when the front door opened. Chase shot him in the head at close range, stepping over his body to move deeper into the house. The violence that followed was methodical and devastating. He found Evelyn and young Jason in the bedroom. The walls of the suburban home echoed with the sharp cracks of the .22 caliber pistol, quickly muffled by the heavy silence that followed. Once again, Chase engaged in his horrific post-mortem rituals upon Evelyn, his mind driving him to consume, to take, to sustain his own fading existence with their vital fluids. The quiet of the neighborhood outside remained entirely undisturbed. The mail was delivered, cars drove past. No one knew that behind the unlocked door, a monster was tearing a family apart. When Chase finally left the Miroth house, he did not leave empty-handed. He carried the lifeless body of baby David with him, slipping back out into the mundane world as easily as he had entered it. The baby's remains would not be found for months, discarded in a vacant lot, another casualty of the open door. The aftermath of the discoveries paralyzed the region. The Sacramento Police Department, seasoned detectives who had seen the worst of human nature, were physically ill at the crime scenes. The sheer brutality, the senselessness of it, defied all conventional investigative logic. There was no forced entry, no shattered glass, no splintered door frames. The killer was walking through the front door like a ghost. When the media released the details that the killer was entering unlocked homes, a wave of visceral panic washed over the city. Hardware stores sold out of deadbolts, chain locks, and window latches in a matter of hours. Gun sales skyrocketed. People adopted large, aggressive dogs. The warm, trusting culture of the California suburbs evaporated overnight. Neighbors looked at neighbors with suspicion, but mostly people looked at their own doors. The nightly routine of checking the locks became an obsessive, terrified ritual. Husbands and wives would check the deadbolt twice, 3 times, unable to shake the image of the hollow-eyed man walking into their hallway. The fear was no longer about the dark alleys or the bad parts of town. The fear was sitting in the living room, staring at the brass handle, wondering if it was turned all the way. Law enforcement eventually caught Richard Chase. Through a combination of eyewitness accounts of the man in the orange parka, footprint analysis, and sheer investigative legwork, they traced the horror back to his apartment. When detectives breached his door, a door he ironically kept locked, they found a space that mirrored the absolute decay of his mind. The apartment was a slaughterhouse. Blood stained the walls, the floors, the kitchen utensils. They found blenders slick with human remains. They found a calendar where he had marked the dates of his hunt. The evidence of his madness was absolute and undeniable. Chase was institutionalized, tried, and eventually died in his cell from an overdose of hoarded medication, a pathetic end to a terrifying existence. But the death of the Sacramento vampire did not erase the psychological scar he left behind. The true horror of Richard Chase is not just the gruesome nature of his crimes, nor the tragic loss of 6 innocent lives. The true horror lies in the terrible, fragile line between safety and slaughter. He proved that the monsters do not always have to break the glass or bash down the wood to get to you. Sometimes they just walk down your quiet street, walk up your concrete steps, and place their hand on your doorknob. They wait for that one momentary lapse in judgment. That one night you are too tired to get off the couch. That one afternoon you are just running out to the garbage can for 5 seconds. They wait for the soft metallic click that tells them the barrier is gone. They wait for the invitation. A Scottish Highlands account described a figure that made no sound. The rain was striking the tin roof of the isolated shelter with the force of handfuls of gravel, making it impossible to hear anything else, which was why the absolute silence of the figure outside felt so deeply wrong. It was exactly 11:45 p.m. when the lone hiker first noticed the dark silhouette moving past the single, cracked window of the stone bothy. The wind sweeping across the barren moorland was strong enough to bend the ancient heather flat against the earth, creating a constant, roaring rush of noise. Yet the tall shape walking just 30 feet away from the glass stood perfectly straight. Its heavy, ragged coat hung motionless around its knees, entirely undisturbed by the gale, as if the entity existed in a completely different physical space, untouched by the violent weather of the world around it. According to the account filed weeks later by an American traveler who had been mapping a remote section of the Scottish Highlands, the strange encounter took place in late October of 2019. He had hiked nearly 14 miles that day, navigating treacherous bogs and steep inclines before seeking refuge in a small, ancient stone structure known only to local shepherds and experienced trekkers. He had secured the heavy wooden door with a rusted iron latch at around 6 in the evening, grateful to escape the rapidly dropping temperature and the creeping gray fog. He had built a small fire in the narrow hearth, drinking bitter tea and reading by the dim light of a single battery-powered lantern. The extreme isolation of the moors was supposed to bring peace, but as he stared out into the darkness that night, he realized he was entirely cut off from the rest of the world, with no cellular service for at least 20 miles in any direction. At first, the traveler desperately tried to rationalize the sight through the window. He reasoned that his exhausted mind was simply playing tricks on him, perhaps projecting the vague shape of a lost stag or a trick of the flickering firelight onto the thick fog rolling outside. But the dark figure did not dissolve into the mist. It took deliberate, impossibly smooth steps through the thick, sucking mud that surrounded the shelter. The hiker slowly leaned closer to the cold glass, using his sleeve to wipe away a layer of condensation. He watched in growing dread as the entity abruptly stopped walking. It turned its upper body slowly, facing the window with a jerky, unnatural motion. The ambient orange light from the indoor fire was barely enough to illuminate the yard, but it was just enough to reveal that the figure was much too tall to be a human being. It stood easily 7 feet high, its limbs unnaturally thin, dangling loosely and motionlessly at its sides. The most unnerving detail, according to the official report he later gave, was the complete lack of physical interaction between the entity and its environment. The highlands in late autumn are famously hostile and raw. The rain was driving in almost sideways, pooling in deep, treacherous puddles across the peat bog. Yet, as the tall figure shifted its weight and took another step toward the bothy, it made absolutely no splash. The heavy, dark shapes that looked like wrapped feet did not sink into the soft mud. It moved with a gliding, mechanical precision, appearing to float just a fraction of an inch above the saturated ground. The hiker held his breath, pressing his back flat against the rough stone wall beside the window. He realized with a cold certainty that whatever was out there was not fighting the severe storm, but completely ignoring it. 10 minutes passed in agonizing, suffocating suspense. The hiker crouched in the dark, having carefully reached over to switch off his lantern so he could not be easily seen from the outside. The only light remaining in the small room was the dying, pulsing glow of the embers in the hearth. He listened desperately for the sound of heavy boots on the stone step outside, or the metallic rattle of the iron latch on the door. There was only the deafening roar of the wind and the endless drumming of the rain. The sheer volume of the storm should have been comforting, acting as a natural barrier between him and the dark, but instead, it felt blinding. If the silent entity decided to break down the door, the hiker knew he would not hear it coming until the old wood splintered inward. A sudden, aggressive drop in temperature forced the hiker to pull his thick wool jacket tighter around his chest. The air inside the small stone shelter turned bitterly cold in a matter of seconds, dropping so fast that his breath plumed in thick, pale clouds before his face. He slowly turned his head, inch by inch, to look back at the small square of the window. The tall figure was no longer standing out in the muddy yard. It was directly on the other side of the glass. The hiker felt his stomach drop, his heart hammering wildly against his ribs. The entity was so close that its broad, dark shoulders blocked out the storm entirely, filling the entire frame of the window with the texture of its heavy, damp-looking garments. It slowly pressed its face toward the glass. The hiker could not move, paralyzed by a deeply primal terror that locked his muscles in place. The face looking in from the storm was entirely devoid of distinct human features. There were no eyes, no discernible mouth, no brow ridge, just a smooth, pale expanse of skin that looked like worn gray leather stretched tightly over an irregular skull. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, The entity raised a long, impossibly thin arm. It pressed a single, elongated hand against the outside of the windowpane. There was no tap of bone, no squeak of wet skin sliding on glass. The absolute dead silence of the gesture made it infinitely more terrifying. As the pale, featureless hand rested against the pane, a thick layer of white frost bloomed rapidly across the window, radiating outward from where the long fingers touched, completely freezing the glass from the outside in until the gray face was entirely obscured by ice. The hiker retreated backward on his hands and knees to the furthest, darkest corner of the room. He gripped a heavy piece of split firewood in his trembling hands, raising it to his chest, and waited for the frozen glass to shatter. He waited for the heavy wooden door to be violently forced open. He sat completely rigid in the freezing darkness for the rest of the night, tracking the agonizing passage of time only by the slow creeping of pale gray light that eventually signaled the arrival of dawn. The furious storm had finally passed, replaced by a dense, quiet morning mist that blanketed the moors. The inside of the bothy was deathly still. At precisely 7:15 a.m., the hiker finally found the courage to stand up. His joints ached terribly from the severe cold and the hours of sustained tension. He approached the door, his throat dry and his hands still shaking. The iron latch was still securely in place exactly as he had left it. The door had not been tested or pushed. The hiker grabbed the handle and shoved it open, wincing at the loud, sharp creak of the rusted hinges, a sound that felt deafening after a long night of straining to hear the impossible. He stepped out into the crisp, biting cold of the Highlands morning. The ground all around the shelter was a thick, muddy paste from the heavy overnight rainfall. He walked carefully around to the side of the stone building, dreading what he might find, to inspect the area directly beneath the single window. According to the statements he would later provide to a skeptical desk officer in a town 40 miles away, there were absolutely no footprints in the mud. There was no sign that a tall, heavy figure had stood there just hours before. There was only one strange disruption in the bleak landscape. Directly beneath the heavily frosted window, the wet grass and muddy peat had been completely replaced by a perfect circle of dry, dead earth, roughly 3 feet in diameter. The soil inside the tight circle was cracked, brittle, and gray, looking as though it had been drained of all moisture and flash-frozen centuries ago. The American traveler went back inside, quickly packed his bag, and left the area entirely, hiking for 9 straight hours without looking back over his shoulder. While local authorities formally dismissed the event as a case of extreme exhaustion and isolation-induced hallucination, older residents in the nearby villages simply nodded when they heard the whispered description. They rarely spoke of the deep moors at night, but when they did, they quietly mentioned that the most dangerous things hunting in the dark are always the ones that never make a sound. A Yorkshire moor incident where voices knew their names. The voice did not sound like the wind scraping through the dense, dying heather, though the high moors were famous for playing cruel tricks on isolated travelers. It sounded perfectly human, cutting cleanly through the thick, freezing fog that had settled over the valley, and it was calmly asking for a man named Thomas. It did not use his given name, however. It used a very specific, childish nickname that had not been spoken aloud by anyone in more than 30 years. Thomas and his younger brother, Samuel, stopped walking immediately, the heavy crunch of their hiking boots fading into the sudden, suffocating quiet of the moorland. They were at least 12 miles from the nearest paved road, deep within a notoriously desolate stretch of the Yorkshire landscape. It was late October, 1998, and the temperature had been dropping steadily since noon. The two men were experienced hikers who had planned a 3-day trek across the elevated peat bogs, carrying heavy packs and relying on a compass to navigate the featureless terrain. The moors possessed a bleak, ancient quality characterized by rolling hills of dark peat, hidden sinkholes, and miles of unbroken, rusted heather. The fog had rolled in around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, dropping a curtain of white over the landscape and reducing their visibility to less than 40 feet. They had been navigating in total, focused silence when the voice first called out. Samuel turned slowly toward his brother. his breath forming pale, ragged clouds in the damp air. Neither man spoke at first. They simply stood on the narrow, rocky sheep path, straining their ears against the vast emptiness around them. According to the police report filed days later, the brothers initially tried to rationalize the terrifying sound. They thought it might have been another hiker lost in these severe whiteout conditions, someone who had coincidentally called out a similar-sounding word distorted by the dense moisture in the air. They waited for a cry for help, or the sound of footsteps on the gravel. Instead, the voice spoke again, drifting smoothly through the gray mist from their left. This time, the words were absolutely unmistakable. The unseen woman asked why Thomas had broken the small porcelain bird on the windowsill of their old house, detailing a very specific, quiet incident from their childhood in 1974 that only the two brothers knew about. The tone was completely conversational, devoid of panic, effort, or cold. It sounded exactly as though the speaker were sitting comfortably in a warm living room just beyond the opaque wall of fog. Samuel felt a cold, leaden dread settle deep in his chest. He noted later to investigators that the voice possessed the exact cadence, the precise pauses, and the soft northern lilt of their mother, who had passed away 7 years prior. Panic began to take root in their minds, but basic survival instincts kept them anchored to the present reality. Thomas gestured sharply for Samuel to keep moving forward, completely abandoning the sudden, irrational urge to call back to the mist. They adjusted the straps of their heavy packs and picked up their pace, their boots slipping against the damp earth and the slick, exposed roots of the vegetation. The mist seemed to thicken with every 100 yards they covered, wrapping around them like a wet, heavy blanket that muffled all ambient noise. The profound silence of the moors returned, broken only by the frantic, uneven rhythm of their own breathing and the dull thud of their footsteps against the peat. For nearly an hour, they hiked in a grueling, terrified silence, checking the magnetic compass repeatedly to ensure they were still heading south toward their designated waypoint. The landscape offered no landmarks, only endless waves of gray and brown fading into the fog. The ambient light began to fail rapidly as the late afternoon gave way to early evening. Around 5:30 p.m., the pale gray fog darkened into an inky, bruising purple. It was then that they stumbled upon something lying directly in the center of their narrow, muddy path. It was a single, heavy leather hiking glove. Thomas crouched down and picked it up with trembling hands. The leather was completely dry, entirely untouched by the pervasive moorland dampness that had soaked everything else in the environment. More disturbing, however, was the stark realization that it was Thomas's own spare glove. It was a distinctive brand bearing a small, frayed scuff mark on the thumb that he instantly recognized. He had securely packed that exact glove at the very bottom of his rucksack early that morning, beneath his sleeping bag and extra clothing. He immediately unbuckled his pack and tore through his meticulously organized belongings. The contents of his bag were undisturbed, but the spare left glove was entirely missing from its sealed, waterproof pouch. Neither man had taken off their packs since noon. The sheer impossibility of the object lying on the trail ahead of them paralyzed them both. As they stood, staring at the leather glove in the fading light, the absolute stillness of the twilight was shattered once again. The voices returned, but there were significantly more of them now. It was no longer just the comforting, familiar sound of their deceased mother. From the deep, featureless shadows to their right came the voice of Samuel's former employer, a man who had moved away a decade earlier, casually discussing the details of a mundane financial spreadsheet. From directly behind them, they heard the distinct, sharp, unmistakable laugh of Thomas's wife. The sounds did not echo across the open landscape. They were flat, incredibly intimate, and projected from various unseen points in the darkness, circling the two men at a radius of what sounded like 50 feet. The brothers abandoned their carefully planned route and began to scramble blindly up a steep, rocky incline, desperately hoping to find higher ground and perhaps escape the dense layer of fog that seemed to be trapping the sounds. The temperature plummeted to near freezing, the cold biting at their exposed faces and hands. The voices did not pursue them aggressively, nor did they raise their volume to shout. They simply kept pace, effortlessly maintaining that invisible 50-foot perimeter no matter how fast the men climbed. As the men exhausted themselves on the steep incline, the casual conversations filtering through the dark began to shift in a deeply sinister way. The unseen entities in the fog stopped reciting old memories and distant conversations. Instead, they began calmly narrating the men's exact present actions. A voice that sounded exactly like Thomas called out from the dark, stating flatly that Samuel was slipping on the wet grass. A fraction of a second later, Samuel lost his footing on a slick patch of moss and fell hard to his knees, scraping his hands raw on the abrasive rock. A voice mimicking Samuel then whispered from the left side of the trail, noting in a clinical tone that Thomas was looking at his compass, but the needle was no longer moving. Thomas stared down at his trembling hand in absolute horror. The red magnetic needle of his compass was frozen perfectly in place, pointing uselessly toward the plastic side casing, completely unresponsive to his frantic twisting and turning. The natural laws of their environment were slowly unraveling, replaced by the impossible logic of the voices in the dark. They had no navigation, no visibility, and no way to outrun the sounds that knew their every move. By 8 o'clock at night, the darkness on the moors was absolute. The fog had merged with the black of the sky, creating a sensory void. Exhausted, freezing, and entirely lost, they managed to set up their small two-person emergency pop-up tent on a relatively flat patch of soft peat. They zipped themselves inside with only a single, dim, battery-powered flashlight illuminating the thin orange fabric of their shelter. They huddled together in the center of the cramped space, clutching their heavy waterproof coats around themselves, shaking from the profound physical cold and the unnatural terror of their situation. Outside the thin nylon walls, the moorland remained dead quiet for a long, agonizingly slow hour. The wind completely died down, leaving an oppressive stillness that pressed against their ears. Then, just after 9:15 p.m., the soft, wet sound of bare feet stepping through the thick mud began to slowly circle the tent. The squelching footsteps were deliberate, unhurried, and impossibly heavy, as if the person walking bore an immense crushing weight. The footsteps stopped directly outside the fabric wall, mere inches from where Thomas sat, with his spine pressed rigidly against the fragile material. The brothers held their breath, their lungs burning, squeezing their eyes shut against the dim light. A voice spoke from the other side of the nylon. It was Thomas's own voice, but it sounded entirely hollow, drained of all warmth, emotion, and humanity. It leaned close to the fabric and whispered a secret that Thomas had never told anyone, not even his brother. It was a dark, deeply personal regret from his early 20s involving a severe, unreported hit-and-run accident on Interstate 90. It spoke the horrible words slowly, savoring the syllables, while something smooth, cold, and heavy dragged lightly against the outside of the tent fabric, sliding down the nylon with a sickening hiss. Samuel squeezed his eyes even tighter, pressing his cold hands over his ears with all his strength, but the voice seemed to bypass his hearing entirely, resonating perfectly and clearly deep within his own skull. He tucked his head between his knees, unable to look at his brother's face, paralyzed by a primitive, overwhelming dread. He remained in that curled, defensive posture, praying silently for the morning sun. According to the official timeline constructed by the authorities, Samuel stayed perfectly still, refusing to open his eyes or lower his hands until the pale, gray light of dawn finally began to filter through the orange fabric of the tent. When he finally found the courage to look up, the harsh reality of the morning offered no comfort. He was completely alone in the small space. The zipper of the tent was still fully closed from the inside, the metal teeth perfectly aligned and undisturbed. Yet, Thomas was entirely gone. He had left behind his heavy leather hiking boots, his insulated winter coat, and his fully packed rucksack. There was no tear in the fabric, no sign of a struggle, and no logical way a grown man could have exited the shelter without unzipping the door. A massive search and rescue operation was launched across the moors later that afternoon, initiated only after Samuel managed to hike down to a small, isolated farming village and dial 999 from a public telephone. Over 40 trained volunteers, tracking dogs, and local authorities combed the desolate landscape for 6 exhaustive days. They found absolutely no trace of Thomas. The tracking dogs refused to approach the campsite, whining and pulling against their leashes. There were no footprints leading away from the tent in the soft mud, no discarded clothing on the moors, and no clues to suggest where he might have gone in the freezing night without his boots or coat. The police eventually suspended the search, filing a formal report that dismissed Samuel's account of the voices as severe psychological trauma. They officially concluded that he had suffered from acute auditory hallucinations induced by extreme hypothermia, physical stress, and isolation. The case was quietly closed, categorized as a tragic wilderness disappearance, the kind that happens occasionally when arrogant hikers underestimate the brutal nature of the high bogs. But the locals who lived on the edge of the vast emptiness knew better than to trust the official police narrative. Months after the search was officially suspended, strange, quiet reports began to surface among the isolated farming communities bordering the moors. Shepherds rounding up stray flocks in the dense evening fog would occasionally hear a lone man's voice drifting across the empty expanse of heather. The voice was always incredibly calm, always perfectly conversational, and it always called the solitary shepherds by their full legal names. It would quietly ask them about their private grievances, their hidden debts, or their quietest sins, speaking from the impenetrable mist just beyond their sight. The legend of the conversational voices on the high moors remains a deeply unsettling local secret, a permanent scar on the landscape, and a quiet warning to those who think the empty places of the world are truly silent.